And we are live. All right, so we're going to have a discussion about effective altruism. Heraclius, is that how your name is pronounced?
Yes, which translates into Hercules. That's why I made it easier. It's a little bit
All right.
difficult to pronounce.
Would you rather me call you Hercules or Heracles? I think Hercules is pretty cool.
Hercules is fine if it's easier.
All right, so Hercules. So you wrote an article where it was titled "Shackling the Poor or Effective Altruism: A Critique of the Philosophical Foundation of Effective Altruism." And you levied a series of critiques of effective altruism, of the philosophical foundations of effective altruism. So the first one you levied is you argued that effective altruism is largely based out of a desire for personal fulfillment and meaning. And you quote Singer saying this. And so you say that effective altruism, as a result of this, it's not actually devoted to improving the lives of people overseas. It only cares about doing that to the extent that it allows effective altruists to gain meaning from their life. For those who don't know, effective altruism is a social movement that says that we should use evidence and reason to figure out the statistically most cost-effective ways of doing good, and then implement those ways rather than merely doing things that make us feel good. And so you cite Singer to make this claim that effective altruism is driven out of a desire for personal meaning, right?
Well, we're going really jumping into the second part of the paper. As you mentioned, this is a critique, which means it tries to see how we are arriving at Singer's argument about effective altruism. So, the point that you just referred is in the process of trying to find the motivation for becoming an effective altruism. And that has been done after going into a deeper exploration of Singer's arguments, and which I trace to his original argument about the drowning baby, because I couldn't find in the literature anything else that could be used as an argument for the philosophical foundation of effective altruism. Now, obviously, you can be an effective altruist by having been convinced by the actions that people do, and they entitle them effective altruists. But you don't have to know the argument behind. Obviously, you can do that's the point with Singer when he says the developments of these arguments, or maybe of the actions that have been taken.
Right. So having read, I think that in the broader corpus of Singer's work, that the quote that you had, I think is paints an inaccurate picture of what Singer's motivation. In fact, a chapter of Singer's book called The Point of View of the Universe, chapter 6, I think, maybe 7, was specifically about why we should not act in accordance merely with our self-interest, and why we ought to act in accordance with what we have impartial reason. And there are a bunch of quotes from this chapter that say this. So, for example, on page 163, he says, any form of dualism of practical reason undermines morality. The dualism of practical reason is the notion that we can either do what's in the best interest of everyone or what's in the best interest of ourselves, and both are fully rational. Page 174, he says, we believe that his response to the evolutionary critique provides a basis for a solution to his own very different worry about the dualism of practical reason and its dismaying implications for the project of putting ethics on a rational footing. On page 189, he says, Crisp accepts what he calls the self-interest principle, which states, in effect, that any agent has a reason to do what will make her life go better, the strength of the reason varying in proportion to the extent to which her well-being will be improved. But this principle itself can be debunked in much the way that Crisp debunked the acts and omissions distinction. So I think in the context of Singer's broader corpus work, it's clear that this is not what Singer is in fact saying. Now, your citation for this, claiming that Singer is saying this, is twofold. So one, you say that, quote, as we saw earlier, Singer admitted that if one does not believe that such suffering and death are bad, then his reasoning will not appeal to them, and they need read no further. However, in this context, Singer is arguing descriptively that it will not motivate an egoist, not that it oughtn't motivate an egoist. So do you agree that Singer is descriptively correct that if a person doesn't care about morality, then the moral arguments won't appeal to them? And then if so, why do you use that to extrapolate that he's saying that we have no reason to act morally outside of our well-being?
Okay, too many things have been put into the discussion, too many parts, and we've been moving from one side to the other. So I will start with your last point, and then we can go gradually progress into the other. Um, it's interesting that Singer says if you don't believe that death is something which is bad. If I'm Let me go back in because I don't want to be misquoting. Um, he
Yeah,
says
the quote is if one does not believe suffering that such suffering and death are bad, then his reasoning will not appeal to them, and they need read no further.
exactly. So, like first of all, so you have to start with this axiomatic, um, let's say, sentence that death is bad. If you don't agree with that, then nothing will appeal to them further on in the paper. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think Singer was saying that if people don't agree that death is bad and that death and suffering of others are bad, then his arguments won't appeal to them. But that's not a claim about what ought to motivate us. That's a descriptive claim about what would motivate a person who doesn't care about death and suffering. And it seems obviously accurate that if a person doesn't care about death and suffering, then his arguments appealing to death and suffering will not motivate them. And Singer, in other passages, makes prescriptive claims that people ought to be motivated by preventing death and suffering.
I like that you're using the classical descriptions of descriptions I would say expressions of descriptive and prescriptive. We're already working within the analytic tradition here in terms of bringing out some of the instances. My point in the beginning is that there is here a disclaimer. Okay, I have evaluated death as bad. Would that you agree with that?
Right.
Now that presupposes that you believe that you're living and then death is something which is coming against the life. And in another instance, Singer has mentioned that you shouldn't be worried about death because otherwise it will be causing you constant anxiety. Now, why I'm saying this is because this already presupposes a particular frame of mind that which can be traced all the way to Plato, that death and life are opposites. Now, if you put that into a critique, and I'm going to be as honest as possible and as authentic as possible, I'm talking about a more phenomenological approach here. Right now, by the minute, because this is part, I should have said that this article is part of my broader project, a book that I've recently written called Altruism, as or the other as the essence of existence. In that book, I'm trying to unpack a little bit the phenomenology of altruism, and here what I'm trying to say in this, let's say, path that I'm following is that if you don't work with the presupposition that death and life are opposites, you can take the approach of the philosophy of existence that by the minute you are born, you're on the way towards death. You're dying. So
Right.
immediately, a more phenomenologically accurate position, if I may, because there is no opposite between death and life in this instance. But I go with the flow, if you will, to use in a very colloquial expression with Singer. And I said, like, I agree with you. To see somebody dying out of a hunger or like needing of medical assistance or any other of these things that he mentions are bad. So we have is obviously if I may say that the initial claim of Singer is evaluative, is not descriptive.
Right.
So he is making an evaluation that something is bad. So we have an evaluation here. And that
Right.
evaluation requires criteria in order to be able to establish why this can be the case. If I want to use like this kind of a terminology about cases. Now, I said I accept that. And let's go and see. Suppose that I agree with you. Let's go and see what you have to say. So what I'm taking is a more Heideggerian approach, which is like I'm not challenging your what you're saying. I'm going with you, following you, because that's how I will. In the book, I'm trying to trace altruism. I'm following you, and see where that leads. Okay,
Right.
so I'm accepting Singer's proposition there, the evaluative, that is bad. Okay, let's move on. How am I going to be motivated? I accept that. How am I going to motivate it? And the issue of motivation here, if I may, is one of the key problematic, let's say, areas that every kind of moral philosophy, moral, I'm not saying ethical, I'm saying moral, has to face. Because you might agree logically that things are this or that, good or bad, however you're going to describe the good or bad, or how you're going to define it, in whatever terms you're going to, if I'm going to use more analytic terms, cash it out. But obviously, um, you need to come back and reflect on these presuppositions and the criteria that you put. So I'm following Singer, and I'm saying, let's go with that. What would be the motivation afterwards?
Right. And the motivation that you claim Singer has is that it's motivated by a desire for meaning and personal fulfillment.
Well,
But
he actually, it was a quote, and that was the point of the quote, is that in his handbook of effective altruism. Now that as we're listening, things come into my head because it's a long time since I wrote this, so I have to go back, and I have to admit I'm not very, very well prepared. But in the handbook of effective altruism, when he talks about the fact that today our lives are nihilistic, or there's a meaning, and people try to search for meaning. The only thing that he says is to pick up effective altruism, that because it gives meaning to someone's world,
yeah,
someone's life.
I can give you the quote where Singer says that. What Singer says is, quote, "We tend to see ethics as opposed to self-interest. The pursuit of self-interest, as standardly conceived, is a life without any meaning beyond our own pleasure or individual satisfaction. Such a life is often a self-defeating enterprise. The ancients knew of the paradox of hedonism, according to which the more explicitly we pursue our desire for pleasure, the more elusive we will find its satisfaction. Ethics offers a solution. An ethical life is one in which we identify ourselves with the other larger goals, thereby giving meaning to our lives. There is harmony between ethics and enlightened self-interest. In comparison with the needs of people going short of food in Rwanda, the desire to sample the wines of Australia's best vineyards pales into insignificance." So that is a claim that Singer was making about how it motivates, about how one way of motivating it is by pointing out self-interest. However, Singer does not say that we have no reason beyond our self-interest. And in fact, in chapter 6 of his book, The Point of View of the Universe, Singer argues in favor of the proposition, firstly, that generally the best way of improving our own self-interest, it will often be helping out others. But then he says, but sometimes it's not. And then he goes on to make an argument as to why we should help others, even if it's not in our self-interest. And he argues that our belief that we shouldn't help others is born out of irrational evolutionary processes that don't result in truth-tracking processes. He devoted an entire chapter of his book to arguing against this notion that we should only do what's in our self-interest and that we have no reason to act impartially. And I can give you dozens more quotes that say this very explicitly.
I would not disagree with you at all in that, but that even complicates the matter even further, because we are oscillating from concepts like reason and motivation. Are these the same? Shall we put them under a critique in order to see, for example, what is reason and what is motivation?
Well, right. So Singer argues that reason and motivation are distinct, that reason is what ought to motivate us, and motivation is a descriptive account of what does motivate us. So Singer argues that descriptively, a person will not be motivated if they don't care about others. But then he makes a claim that we have normative reason to care about others, even if we descriptively happen not to care about others. And he devotes a chapter to defending this view. And so an example of the distinction would be, an example given by Parfit, where Parfit said a person might act in revenge. His motivation may be revenge, but you still might say that he had no reason to do what he did, because our reasons are distinct from that which motivates us. So Singer argues that what we should do is distinct from that which motivates us, and that when egoists are motivated by their self-interest, they're acting irrationally. And so given that, I don't understand how you can adhere to the view that Singer, his goal is for altruism is to bring about self-interest, when he devoted an entire chapter to saying that that shouldn't be the goal of our altruism, and that's just an added benefit of altruism.
If I may, we have to distinguish. Are you challenging me that I have a different hermeneutic of a proper meaning of interpreting the text, or are we challenging now whether a reason can be motivating for someone, or are these the same? Because there's one way to, I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. There's one thing if I have a misinterpreted Singer, if perhaps there is a proper interpretation of a text, but that's a different story. Let's not go there. And there's another thing about whether a reason can be itself motivating, because if we start with the latter, then we will have to see, for instance, how Singer, we might say that, but we know in the history of philosophy, excuse me, that even Kant, and I make that point in the article, if you don't pose as an ultimate end as a regulating idea, you will never be able to justify ultimately something. And that can be seen in different philosophers. I'm simplifying here, but for the sake of the discussion. But you can see that also in Hume, you can see it also in Wittgenstein. And I'm using very, very analytic friendly philosophers. I wouldn't go to others who might be difficult in terms of explaining. But that's the whole point about reason and motivation. And if I say, you might argue, okay, you might argue and you might say, for instance, logically, and I put that in very quotations and self-consciously, being a Greek, about the misappropriation and appropriation of the term logos, okay, and logic and what constitutes logic. Now, you can say, for instance, as Hume says, I can convince you reasonably, okay, or logically, or however you want to say it, that this is the case. And then he says, when I go out in life, in real life, then what happens is I forget.
Right. So
just give me 1 second to finish, if I may. Now, so there's one point there is how can reason be motivating, and then we will say, for instance, like who holds the scepter of knowing what reason is and logic is, and whatever you want to call the proper way of thinking. One, because that will take us into the idea of the point of the universe, as if there is any such a point of the universe. I don't know. Well, we can go there, but the other part, what you were challenging me, and take the challenge, is whether there's like a misinterpretation of Singer. What I was trying to do, following his text, is to see the motivation of everything in terms of being an effective altruism, and the motivation will always be giving reasons which are this or that, as you have been describing. But ultimately, everything will go back to self-interest in terms of trying to justify, because precisely there is, as Kant said, if you don't posit an ultimate end, things will not flow in the way that you want them to flow. If I'm not mistaken, and in the groundwork, one of the key lessons that we have is that when Kant says that why would be the motivation to follow the command of reason, I have no answer to give you.
Well, okay, so I think that the criticism that I have of your paper, or of this part of your paper, I have a series of other criticisms that we'll get to later, but is twofold. I think that you're incorrect about your descriptive claim about what Singer was saying. I think that Singer was saying
it's a hermeneutic, so it's a hermeneutic challenge that you're giving me now.
Right. So I think that Singer is very clear that he thinks not only that that Singer was just making a descriptive claim about motivation, that if you don't care about others, then you're unlikely to be motivated by arguments that appeal to others. But if you do care about others, then you will be motivated. And so I think that your paper misrepresented what Singer was saying in that context by equating between the two different types of reasons. An example of the distinction would be, for example, suppose I'm a staunch Republican, and you're convinced that Republican politics are really bad, and that I'm just so staunch and so dug in that I cannot be convinced that Republican politics are good. You might say that if you're a staunch Republican, you won't be motivated by arguments that appeal to helping the Democrats. But then you might also say that I shouldn't be a staunch Republican. So Singer was making a descriptive claim about what would motivate people, not a prescriptive claim about what should motivate people. Singer was looking at what we have reasons to do rather than what we in fact do. You say that Singer goes back to self-interest. He explicitly doesn't. In fact, he criticizes in his book Crisp's notion that we should act in our self-interest, and argues that when we act in our self-interest, we're acting irrationally. He analogizes it to a person with what's called future Tuesday indifference, who just irrationally neglects their suffering on future Tuesdays. So self-interest is similar because we're not responding to reasons that involve helping others. And I mean, I think that if there's just the prescriptive claim is the one that your critiques apply to, but the descriptive claim is just trivial and like obviously the case. I mean, it is obviously the case that if I'm not motivated by caring about others, then a plea that appeals to helping others will not motivate me. So given I'm just not sure what claims that Singer made you're disagreeing with that don't involve misrepresenting what I think Singer meant and what Singer was saying.
I'm not sure if misrepresenting is the let's say a just term in this case, since I am quoting Singer and you quoted exactly the part that I was referring to in the paper at that point. Now, I do hold reservations with your insistence on using the term descriptive. Nothing. I would be very cautious to say that something is descriptive, because descriptive also refers to the descriptor and the person who describes. And the person who describes is not a person who can be neutral. I think that from a feminist perspective, I think we know from the work, the field work of Lucy Irigaray, that to speak is never neutral. So I'm not comfortable with the claim that a claim can be descriptive. I know that in analytic philosophy, they're comfortable in saying that there's a distinction between fact or something that can be objective or neutral free, but I am not comfortable with that distinction. And I'm not sure how to approach it in terms of having something which is with not being evaluative. Now, apart from that, the point about whether you can be utterly motivated by care of the others, I think that has been exhaustively analyzed by Nietzsche in his critique on Herbert Spencer. I don't think we need to go there with this possibility. So that's why I'm making this. I know we're oscillating between whether I have misrepresented Singer and whether something could be actually the case. Now, even if I go with your distinction that he's making a descriptive claim that you can be motivated by something which is self-interest, but you're saying that he makes the descriptive claim, if I'm understanding you correctly, afterwards, that we shouldn't be motivated by that. Is that correct?
Right. He's saying that a person might be motivated by self-interest, but they're acting wrongly.
But then again, we fall into dialectic here, because and dialectic here means that in order to be able to uphold the descriptive, we go into the prescriptive, and in order to uphold the prescriptive, we will fall back into the descriptive. So I was looking for a pure motivation that will allow me to become an effective altruist in terms of how it's being discussed, in such a way as it won't have any kind of, as in Singer's words, a sacrifice of something of a comparable importance. That was my attempt, was trying to find, and I couldn't find a motivation.
Well, okay, so in terms of what you said, so you said that you don't think you're misrepresenting him, given that you provide quotes. Now, I obviously don't think that you're maliciously, intentionally misrepresenting Singer, but I think that the things that you think Singer is saying are distinct from the things that Singer thinks Singer is saying. And I think Singer is very clear about that and devoted a chapter to arguing against the view that you accuse Singer of arguing for. You say that there's no firm divide between descriptive and prescriptive things. I agree somewhat that it's hard to draw a firm divide and that there will be some evaluation, but we can still generally draw lines in terms of figuring out if things are generally descriptive or prescriptive. So if I say the rock is on the table, that's not a claim about what ought to be, that's a claim about what is. Now, it's true that what is will be influenced by my social relation, a series of epistemic considerations, etc., but we can still make descriptive claims about what is. Facts are obviously not the same thing as values. To say that a person is motivated by something, it's not the same thing as saying that a person ought to be motivated by something. I could say that Jeffrey Dahmer found it motivating to kill people, but that does not mean that I'm pro being motivated to kill people. And Singer analogously says that people may be motivated by self-interest, but says that they're acting wrongly to be. You say you say you brought up Nietzsche, but I'd be curious as to what the argument that Nietzsche has that makes self-interest logically impossible. Obviously, we can care. It's possible to care about others. People frequently do things that care about others and that act in ways that attempt to help other people. Lastly, you say that you're trying to figure out what is fundamentally motivating Singer and what's motivating effective altruism. So Singer is making sort of two distinct pleas. One, he's arguing that even if you are self-interested, you should help others. But then he says, and you shouldn't be self-interested. You should help others for its own sake. He makes two separate pleas. One of them is in the point of view of the universe, where he's extremely clear about what is motivating effective altruism. For Singer, effective altruism is motivated by wanting to help others and improve the well-being of conscious creatures. For people like William McCaskill, McCaskill is also loosely a utilitarian. It's also motivated by wanting to help others and just improve the well-being of sentient beings. And so, I think that these descriptive claims are distinct from the prescriptive claims. But even if it were the case that effective altruism were motivated by self-interest, if a person saved the lives of hundreds of children, even if they only did that out of a demand for fame and for fortune, if they save the lives of a bunch of children, I still think that that's a good thing, regardless of the thing that it is that motivates them to do that.
Again, I'm trying to follow you. You have like a very, I really enjoy the plurality of the things that we're putting in the table. So let's go back to the idea of the motivation, because I want to remind you that the paper is a critical paper. Okay, and the whole point of the paper is to be able to find whether there is something which is first of all to say whether it's logical in the classic sense, because we're still, and I'm underscoring that we're still in a particular frame of thinking right now, which is sometimes called the metaphysics of presence, which means that we're working with being, which this is the currency of our thought, as you said before, because you mentioned that that even if we put some principles, epistemic principles, that we can all agree that like we can say that something is the case and we utterly find descriptive, that something is the case, but something is the case here will always presuppose some kind of let's say aesthetic standards that we take that we consider to be normal. Okay, that's why the normal. Now, because you mentioned a lot of things, my point in the beginning is to say, I follow you, Singer. Can you give me a motivation for being effective altruist? Okay, and even if I take your challenge and accept your criticism and acknowledge the reception that you say that I misrepresent, even if that's the case, okay, that is to be discussed. To what extent can we make a normative claim here about having a particular meaning that is in the text? Then I would say that, as you said, she says that you can be motivated by self-interest, but you shouldn't. And my question is, what is the other possibility of being motivated if it's not self-interest for Singer? I couldn't find anything else apart from an evolutionary perspective, which again he's struggling to make fit in his schema, because he's trying to put both reason, something which is supposed to be stable and universal and permanent, with an evolutionary perspective, which is supposed to be something which is becoming and changing. Okay, so can I ask, according to your perspective, the way that you understand a singer, you acknowledge that one way that you can be motivated to be an effective altruist is self-interest. Okay, which this is a term which I haven't mentioned, by the way, in the paper. So I'm opening to the risk of being entangled by meanings which I haven't even introduced in the paper. Nowhere in the paper will you see the concept of self-interest. In that sense that Singer uses it. It's not my point of view that there's a self-interest. I'm saying that there's a movement that comes from us to the other in order to come back to ourselves. I'm trying to think in the paper, not through the metaphysics of presence, but through the logic of movement. Okay, something that like looking at things in a more in a different way than the classical way. So I'm asking, according to your interpretation of the text of Singer, which you might have done even better work than I have. What is the other motivator that Singer gives in terms of being an effective altruist?
Yeah, so Singer argues that we have irreducible normative reasons. There are certain things that give us independent reason to care about them that we can deduce through reason. And so similarly to how through reason we can discover that we should think that the earth is round rather than flat, our reason also allows us to discover we should avoid suffering, given that the experience of suffering gives us reason to avoid it. And he goes in the point of view of the universe, he goes through a painstaking process of arguing against our intuitions that are non-utilitarian and arguing for utilitarianism. That's what motivates him. He argues that our motivation is distinct from things we have reason to do, that we have reason to do what increases the well-being of sentient beings. So in terms of what you said, so you point out that the paper is a critique. Sure, but I think that the critiques that you're levying are inaccurate to what Singer says.
Sorry, how can a critique be inaccurate?
Well, I think you're saying Singer says certain things, and then you're disagreeing with those certain things. I think Singer does not say those certain things, does not express the ideas that you think, that you argue that he expresses. In fact, I think Singer disagrees with the ideas that you accuse him of agreeing with. You said that you couldn't find anywhere else in Singer's corpus of work where he expresses motivation for effective altruism. Well, I think you should check out the point of view of the universe to look at much of his motivation, because, I mean, in that book, he goes through a very painstaking process over the course of 400 pages, I think, maybe more. I don't know how many pages the book is, and argues very slowly and deliberately for utilitarianism and for why that should motivate us. The question of what should motivate us is different from the question of what does motivate us. So I might say that a genocidaire is motivated by a desire to commit genocide, yet they're still acting wrongly to commit genocide, because if I am like Singer, I'm a moral realist, and Singer is a moral realist. You say Singer attempts to ground it aside from evolution. Well, Singer in chapter 6 answers the evolutionary argument against utilitarianism. He argues that evolution, similarly to how evolution results in us coming to form reliable beliefs about things like mathematics, it also allows us to come to certain beliefs about ethics. And so he establishes certain criterion for determining which of our ideas can be evolutionarily debunked, and which of them are likely to develop as a result of truth-checking processes. And then he argues that utilitarianism is likely to develop as a result of truth-checking processes. But I have a question for you. I mean, you make a lot of these claims about the things that Singer says and the motivation for him. What claims has Singer made that you disagree with in his paper?
What claims have I made that Singer disagree? No, what claims the Singer has done in his paper that I disagree with?
Yes, that's the question.
Do I have to disagree?
Well, I mean, if you're going to criticize it and you agree with everything he says, I mean, I don't know if that's.
I'm not criticizing. Again, that's why I mentioned earlier I'm putting something into a critique. I'm not necessarily saying something is wrong or something is false or something is untrue. I'm critiquing. I'm asking for reasons, as you said. Now, when you mentioned earlier that the painstaking effort that Singer does in order to talk about the point of the universe, and you talk about moral realism. Now, again, we're going into that kind of classification and thinking in the classic dialectical way of moral realist or moral universalist and moral relativist. And I do attempt to make that clear in the paper when I say, for instance, that the arguments of Rachel's, for example, in terms of having a moral realism.
Sorry to cut you off. Just later we can go into the realism versus relativism stuff.
No, just because you mentioned it, if you want, we can go later. But what I wanted to say is that we still haven't tackled the idea of motivation. And you told me about the point of the universe and reasons. And still the question about the relationship between reason and motivation has not been even touched upon. It seems we're flirting with this as if we're like in a primitive way, flirting around it, dancing around it, but we're afraid to go into it. If, as you say, I accept what you say, that the motivation, that Singer acknowledges that can be self-interest as motivation, but then we shouldn't do that. We should take the point of the universe, prescriptive. And I ask, why should we take that? That's why I told you earlier that I think we're falling into dialectic here, which will be an endless dialectic. And I'm talking about dialectic here in the Hegelian sense, just to be 100% clear of what I'm saying. And I'm saying, even if I take the point of the universe, okay, why should I take the point of the universe? Why?
Well, so I mean, Singer argues that the point of view of the universe describes what we have the most reason to do, that we have these normative reasons, similarly to how we have descriptive reasons, so similarly to how we have the most reason to come to conclusions about truth matters as to what a rational person would conclude when given our information. So, for example, I mean, the reason why I think I'm justified in thinking that the Earth is round is because I think I have the most reason to believe it. And asking for a reason for why we should act in accordance with reason is sort of a question that does not make sense in the context of what a reason is. Reasons ought to motivate us, that's what they are. Singer argues that there are these motivational reasonings. You said that we haven't talked about motivation. I think we have. Singer says that what motivates Singer is wanting to improve the well-being of conscious creatures. And he says that we also should be motivated by that. But then he says, but even if you're only motivated by self-interest, I still have a plea that will appeal to you. And so as a result...
If I can interrupt you, we're still getting away because we are meddling reason and motivation. And I will again refer to Kant and again refer to that idea that even if you take reason in its absolute form, like that, that you have to go to reason as if there's such a thing as a reason or the objective point of the universe, or however you want to say it in these terms, which need a lot of unpacking because they're like really sedimented with a lot of history of philosophy and different let's say ways of approaching them and interpreting them. Even if that is the case and you want to take the possibility of the point of the universe, the motivation is still a question to be asked. Why should I do that? Now, asking why, you can say that you're asking me for a reason. Okay. And you will be right if you ask me that. And I give you that before you even ask me about that, because I'm asking you why. Okay. That's reason in one sense. But ultimately, you will find no possible way of motivating someone with reasons, if that reasons is just like some kind of like propositional way of offering someone something that they can make sense. It's a beautiful point when in the Notes of the Underground, Dostoevsky said, I can have, thinking of Laplace there, obviously, that you can tell me all the possible scientific theories and logical theories of the world. Everything can be actually fitting in one grand scheme of things, and it can all make perfectly sense. All may be reasonable and logical. And he can say, and Dostoevsky says, but I can shatter it into pieces in an instance. Why? Because I can. Reason is, there's so much that can do about reason, and another way that I'm trying to sketch it out in my paper is through the idea again from Kant in the critique, in the first critique, when he says if you don't posit an ultimate end, reason won't work. Even pure reason won't work if you don't put an end ens realissimum in an posited as an ultimate end. Now, whether it be God, or whether it be evolutionary theory, or whether it be something else that you reach as an end, that's something to be decided, but reason won't work. Now, the objective point of the universe allow me to say that I find this point completely incomprehensible. How can you have the perspective of the universe? People who believe that they can have the point of the universe, they can say that you have to take the point of the universe. But again, the motivation for me to take, or for anyone to take the point of the universe is lacking. And if I may go back into the beginning, we still haven't tackled the thought experiment of Singer when he says that he's trying to make the logical parity. There's no reason when you feel that, for example, that you have to save someone, there's some kind of spontaneity there. I don't think we will be able to put inferential logic there in the sense that, oh, I see a drawing problem, I think that I should help it.
Okay, so first, well, so I mean, top level. I mean, I think that if you don't disagree with any of what Singer says, then I'm happy with that result. If you agree with Singer on everything, I don't think that effective altruism shackles the poor. If you think Singer's right about everything, say what is motivation and what's motivating it. Well, Singer is motivated by the things that he thinks he has reason to do. We're rational when we respond to what we have most reason to do. Similarly to how in epistemic realms, I'm rational if I believe the things that I have the most reason to believe. I might have a weak reason to think that the earth is flat, but I have a much stronger reason to think the earth is round. Hence, I conclude that the earth is round. And so Singer is motivated by what we have the most reason to do. And he argues that we should be motivated by what we have the most reason to do based on what a reason is. Reasons ought to motivate us to the extent that we're rational. You say that reasons don't motivate. I agree, reasons don't always motivate, but reasons ought to motivate. And so, I mean, in epistemic domains, you might have a person who thinks that the earth is flat. I think they're acting unreasonably. The reason to believe their position is wrong might not motivate them, but they still, in fact, have a reason to come to the opposite conclusion. You said that Kant, you cite Kant saying we need an ultimate end. Well, I think that the things that we have reason to do corresponds with what we have an ultimate end. We have the most reason to act in accordance with what we have the most reason to do, almost tautologically. And Singer argues that the end that we should have is the point of view of the universe, to use the phrase that Sidgwick used and that Singer also used in his book, The Point of View of the Universe, of what in total there is the most reason to do. Similarly to how, I mean, again, going back to epistemology, in epistemic domains, when we decide what we should believe, we look at what we have the most reason to believe. And what, from the point of view of the universe, the universe that we're provided, the things that we know, gives us the most reason to believe. You say, why and how do we have the point of view of the universe? Well, obviously, we don't literally have the point of view of the universe. We're not looking at things directly from a bird's eye view. But Singer, this was a phrase used by Sidgwick slightly in jest about how we should take a bird's eye view and figure out what is impartially best rather than looking at what is best in our own self-interest. We can keep going on this point for a little bit, but I want to move on to some of the other points raised in your paper.
Am I allowed to make some comments on these points? Because there are so many things that, and I keep forgetting, and I'm trying to note some things. In terms of the beginning that you said, if I'm disagreeing with anything that Singer says, I will mention it because I think that it hasn't been clarified to my satisfaction, if you will, to my self-interest, is that a critique doesn't take sides. That's why, like, a critique is being in that point where you are able to say that you are able to, like, as if you are on a sim, you are able to bring things together. Now, what I'm doing in this paper, in this critique, is up to a point. I do make an evaluative statement in the end, if you want to say that, is that I believe that that what is happening with effective altruism is ultimately that what you mentioned in your, like, it's so much challenging me on, is that the point of the universe neutralized, because it's not possible to take the point of the universe. It's not possible. It's like, it's a bad, I would use a Sartrean expression, it's bad faith. It's as if you want to become God. Okay. And I think that I will be aligned here with a feminist critique on this point. But apart from that, again, we should stop and think about, if you don't posit an end, and then we have to problematize what that end is. You can never have something like what you mentioned as reasons which motivate or that should motivate. Obviously, I posit like what I have an implicit reason, an ultimate end, and based on that, every kind of logic will begin, and they will fit. Now, when you say, for instance, the example of the flat Earth, as much as I don't believe that the flat Earthers, I'm also still skeptical about the scientific worldview after reading Feyerabend's critique. So obviously, again, I'm saying we're working within a particular way of thought still, and I'm still navigating myself and trying to swim in the waters of the metaphysics of presence, which is another way of saying that we have things that can be and the distinctions between fact and non-fact. But I want to clarify something you said. Why should a paper be always about the violence, about convincing someone and having a winner and a loser? I'm not here to win over Singer. That's not what my point. That's why I told you my book is about trying to unpack a little bit the phenomenology of altruism. I'm not trying to say that Singer is wrong. I'm saying that if you want to ultimately force me, and I follow you in this destructive path in terms of like forcing me to make a point about what I'm arguing, as if arguing here is to convince someone about something, is that insofar as we are being effective altruists according to the way that Singer has proposed it, and even more so McCaskill, because with McCaskill the situation is even more difficult. At least Singer has some kind of like perspective in terms of the thought experiment that he poses. But with McCaskill, insofar as we take this kind of effective altruism, we don't reflect on why we're doing stuff and why we have to give to charity and this kind of representational charity, then we will always use the poor in order to be able to be effective altruists. The condition, transcendentally, of effective altruism is the existence of the poor. But the existence of the poor is not ultimately justified or should exist.
Okay. So we can move on. I just have few more questions about this. So, given our discussion of Singer's motivation, now he's motivated by impartial reasons, etc. So would you agree that Singer's position was not that reason cannot motivate the enterprise? That Singer would not agree with the claim that reason alone cannot motivate the enterprise, the business for producing the well-being of the other, cannot find, fund, and found a foundational ground to help the other. Would you agree that Singer would disagree with that claim? that he would think that reason can provide a grounding for that.
Well, Singer can disagree. Obviously, I can say that he could disagree, but he doesn't own the meanings of the text that he writes. The meanings disseminate in the text, and a possible interpretation of the text is that.
Okay, but you said that Singer disagrees with that, and then in your paper, verbatim, you says that Singer agrees with that, and that Singer thinks that reason alone cannot motivate an enterprise.
I don't understand what you're trying to say to me. In my paper, I say that Singer agrees with that. Can you refer me exactly to which section of the paper you're talking to?
Yeah, so you say, quote, in this case, however, helping the other does not...
Can you tell me about the page so I can refer to it exactly?
Yeah, let me find it. In this case...
So we can work per scriptum.
Yeah, so this is on page 40.
On page 40, then. So
yeah. You say, according to Singer in his later effective altruist writings and the natural development of his arguments, securing of the well-being of the other does not seem to be propelled exclusively by a mandate of reason, nor by an immediate intuitive compulsion, but out of a personal pursuit of happiness, which would come about by creating a meaningful life. And this means having a purpose, since we live in a time when many experience their lives as empty and lacking in fulfillment. In this case, however, helping the other does not come from the well-being of the other being the reason as the end in and of itself, but instead as a personal reason to have a meaningful life. Ethics offers a solution. So I could go on, but I mean...
Yeah, exactly. I'm happy that you mentioned it. Shall we go and do a close reading of what I've written? I've never done a close reading to myself, but there we go. According to Singer in his later effective altruist writings, okay, I think that's accurate. In the natural development of his arguments, since the original one was the 1972 paper, securing the well-being of the other does not seem, I'm not making a normative claim here that does not seem to be propelled exclusively by a mandate of reason. Exclusively.
Right. So
it means that there's room, that even if it's reason, there is room for something else to creep in. And I'm saying an immediate intuitive compulsion, because in the beginning of the text, following his arguments, the thought experiment is all about a immediate perception, if I may. So there's no issue about reason, their discussion.
Yeah, so to clarify, I mean, the sentence that I disagree with the most is you say, in this case, comma, or I don't know why I said the comma loud. In this case, however, helping the other does not come from the well-being of the other being the reason as an end in and of itself, but instead it is a personal reason to have a meaningful life.
That is how the quote that I used says, live in a time when many people experience their lives as empty and lacking in fulfillment. So effective altruism can give them a meaning in their life. So I'm saying that, and I don't think I disagree with you in a sense, in what you're saying, that there could be reason for someone who believes. Obviously, if you're in the frame of mind of the object of the objective view of the universe, and that you should have a duty and all that kind of stuff, if you're in that frame of mind, so you're well entitled to, and you will be motivated by your reason. Because this is ultimately your reason, and all other people who believe in the same way as you, like a culture has a particular set of beliefs. Okay, now absolutely you'll be motivated by that, because this is what you have ultimately posited as end, to reach the objective of the universe. Okay, that's what you have posited.
Right.
That's your entitlement. But however,
if we agree that Singer's motivation was not about that Singer's plea and motivation for effective altruism was not based on personal self-interest, but was based on achieving the point of, or doing what's best from the point of view of the universe, then we don't disagree.
I'm not saying again. I'm not saying that. I don't know what Singer ultimately believes at this moment. But obviously, there's a discrepancy of time between the time that Singer wrote that and the time that we're talking now. so many things have happened. We have a crisis of a virus spread in the meantime. Nobody anticipated. Things can change. Okay, I'm not saying what Singer believes. I'm not going to go into that kind of idea of a romanticism of trying to find a particular intention as a transcendental signifier of that Singer is or could be, and trying to find a particular intention of meaning as if it could be done. I'm just saying that according to his writings, the way that he tries to motivate me or anybody else in this part of his writings is by a way of having a meaningful life, because otherwise you don't have a reason to be an effective altruist. There's a short circuit in the logical process.
I mean,
in effective altruism, because you feel good when you give. And I think
Singer argues that is a reason for why we should be an effective altruist, but we have stronger reason to act impartially, even if it didn't make it us feel good, should do it. But I think we're beating a dead horse. Just one final question on this. Well, actually, I mean, I answered it earlier, but yeah. So just you agree that you don't disagree with any of the claims Singer made. You're merely criticizing.
I didn't say disagree. I didn't say I disagree or agree.
Right. So just yes or no. Do you disagree with any of the claims that Singer made?
You are now trying to put me in a position. You see what you're doing now. You're trying to put me in a position to force me to say yes or no. Why do I have to force into this binary of yes or no? Well, in some cases yes, in some cases no, because here the point is not about what Singer says at the end of the day, because as Singer says himself, you can be convinced to be more effective altruist without even having read his arguments. So if we are to make like if it's a hermeneutic point that you want me to make, we can discuss about whether the meaning whether the text has a particular meaning that Singer can control after having used these words which were not his and have like a plurality of meanings, or if the issue is about effective altruism. Do you see what I'm trying to say here? If it's a hermeneutic point that you're trying to make, then we can change the register of the discussion and talk about hermeneutics.
Yeah, that's fine.
I thought we're talking about whether there is a motivation about effective altruism which could not short circuit into self-interest.
Right, and I think Singer has argued that there is not. But I mean, I think we've been going down this element of the Singer route for a while. I have some more questions and disagreements with other parts of your paper.
Sure.
So you quote McCaskill saying, quote, "The average income across all countries was the equivalent of $2 per day or less. Even now, more than half of the world still lives on $4 per day or less. Yet through some outstanding stroke of luck, we have found ourselves as the inheritors of the most astonishing period of economic growth the world has ever seen, while a significant portion of people stay as poor as they have ever been." Then you end the quote and you say, "I let the reader decide how much luck has to do with the lack of food as a result of the building of our colonial empire. How much luck and lack is involved in slavery, genocide, and ethno-cleansing, which have made us, the Western world, the inheritors of the abundance that McCaskill describes." So McCaskill here is arguing that we're lucky in a self-interested sense to be in the top 0.1% in terms of income historically. How does this deny the etymological factor shaping the things that have resulted in us being quite wealthy by the standards of history?
If you do a deconstruction of the text that I have written, you will see that the same argument is where we're going to end up in the same problem here of the self-interest, of the short circuit. First of all, apart from, even if I take the point of like a grand narrative, even from the point of view of a grand narrative, this is inaccurate. That for almost all of human history, what McCaskill says here is at least, if I say inaccurate, or at least serving a self-interested purpose, because I'm sure that East Bengal was not something that happened by itself. It was a colonial war, a division of the country of the countries there in order to be able to have a particular influence.
Right. I mean, Singer's making a descriptive claim that we're a lot richer than most people throughout history. How does that deny the history of colonialism?
I'm not saying that.
Sorry, not Singer. I meant to say McCaskill.
McCaskill. McCaskill here he seems to say that it's an issue of luck with you
Well,
that we have become the inheritors of a wealth which is in the West. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
we're lucky that
Sorry,
we're
but
not.
I'm not. I don't think that it will be extreme negligence. It will be extreme um, violence from our side to be able to even to agree. Here you will say you will I will affirmatively say that personally I let the reader in the paper decide how they want to do that, but personally I disagree, and not only
Well, I mean, can't we?
historically, if you will, because colonial wars have made Europe, the Western Europe, what it is.
Sure. I mean, can't we say that we're lucky that we happen to have been the beneficiaries of the colonialism? Like from a self-interested standpoint, like we got the long end of the stick.
But if you ascribe that to luck, is to waive your responsibility from it.
I mean, I don't think so. You might say that like a really bad thing happened, and we're lucky that it didn't
No,
happen
it
to
didn't
us.
happen. It wasn't passive. People do things.
Right?
It
People
didn't
do
happen.
things.
People do
Yeah,
things. It
sure.
didn't
People
happen.
do things.
Here we
We're
need to be
lucky they didn't do them to us.
a little bit more precise in our in the way that we handle language, because passive voice here can allow for meanings which are which will do violence to the other. It didn't happen. Wars didn't happen. Wars that are happening now didn't happen. We do them and we perpetuate them,
Yeah,
and
and
these wars produce
I don't think
poverty.
I don't think McCaskill would deny that, but another because I have a lot to get. I have some
Okay.
more questions, and I think we can leave this one up to the reader, as it were.
We'll leave that to. That's why I let that to the readers to decide how much luck and luck are associated here.
Yeah.
But even for that particular reason, I wanted to show, for example, that McCaskill is being unreflective, and he's being unreflective because from all human history, from the evolution of Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago until the Industrial Revolution, the average income across all countries was the equivalent of $2 is inaccurate.
Wait, what? Why do you think it's inaccurate?
Because I'll explain it later on. When
Okay,
it comes
well,
to helping others, being unreflective means being ineffective. It is not the case that poverty for almost all of human history was a matter of income and money.
yeah, actually, well, that's actually the next quote that I had a question about. So your next, or maybe 2 quotes. We'll see. Okay, so the next thing you say, since EA sticks to capitalism, EA is always going to be ineffective since it does not reflect on the phenomenon of poverty and the development of its representations. If we really were to be altruistic effectively, then we should realize Singer's analogy differently by reflecting on how to wade in and pull out the other from poverty, and not just from the way poverty is represented within a capitalist setting. So the definition of poverty that you criticize is having very little money. And that's the way that McCaskill is using the word, and that's common usage today. So do you agree with the description that it is good to help people who have little money not die of malaria? If you agree with the normative claim that McCaskill is making, is your disagreement not just semantic, that you're using the word differently from him?
No, it's not semantic actually. And that's why I said to you that we're still using the framework of a particular metaphysics here. And that's the problem, because that's what the critique is all about. In principle, I agree with Singer in the sense of pulling out and wading in and pulling out the other from poverty. But Singer doesn't go all the way, because he says that we are stuck in, for like it or not, we are stuck for the foreseeable future in capitalism. And that's why we should be effective altruists with money and giving percentage of our money. Now, what I'm saying in my critique is something which is simple. I agree in principle. In principle, I agree with altruism, because I'm writing on altruism myself.
Right. So I mean,
Let me
it
finish
is.
one, because this is important. This is very important. But in principle, yes, I agree that we need to wade in and pull out the other from poverty. But that would mean to do as we would have done for a baby and saving its life. That would mean to eradicate poverty. and not just to give charity which sustains poverty, because in order to give money means that we stick to a particular representation of poverty. And I'm
Well,
saying it again, a particular way of representing poverty. And
I
I'm
mean,
going to the conceptual meaning of poverty, which means, even from Plato, that and all the way until Aristotle idealized the world, it has to do with whether you can move or not. Hence the title of the paper, Shackling the Poor, because the poor, if you give them a representational charity, as I have been giving in the paper, they will not be able to move by themselves. They will always
right.
be restricted in their autonomy.
Yeah, so I mean, the definition of poverty given by the Britannica dictionary is poverty is the state of one who lacks a usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. And so if that's the way that he's using the word, then if you use the word differently, I mean, if we had just changed the sentence around so that it was instead, we should realize, and by reflecting on how to wade in and pull out the other who lacks money, and not just the way that the one who lacks money is represented within a capitalist setting. If we had just replaced the word poverty with person who lacks money, would your criticism still apply? Because if so,
it still applies, and it still applies, and it still applies, and it won't go away until we stop using monetary representations in order to be able to express poverty. Because you gave a definition of poverty according to a dictionary, which some people wrote. That's not the objective point of the universe, and it's not some kind of like Bible that gives you a particular meaning. It's what we call the proper usage of a word. The dictionary.
Right. I mean, shouldn't we look to common usage when determining what words mean, rather than like
common usage? Of course, you can start having it as a reference, but I was, of course, this is today. That's what I'm making a point here in my paper, because we are stuck with this kind of meaning, this common usage, which common here also has to the portion of like commons and exchange. What is exchange in our days effectively? Okay, like money, like words that are exchanged. Now, I'm saying that if you stick to that kind of representation of poverty and you don't critique it and you don't say, for example, is that poverty what it is? Is it money always about? Is poverty all about money? No.
Well, it is on the common definition. It's not having very much wealth.
Just because the common definition might be violent and offensive in terms of like to some people, that doesn't mean, or it supports a particular way of looking at the world. That doesn't mean that this is the way that things could be, or could unfold, or could take place.
So your disagreement with McCaskill is you think he uses the word poverty in a way differently from how you think we should.
No, this is not what I'm saying. It's not about semantics here. This is about ways of life.
Well, but it's not ways of life. It's ways of using a word.
No, it's not. If you think about it this way, that's because we are so habituated in using it. Just because we're habituated in using one word, that doesn't mean that this is the proper way or the word can be. I'm giving you a historical evidence of poverty being related to the body.
Right. So let's say that McCaskill had just not used the word poverty at all. He had just, instead of using the word poverty, he had just, wherever he wrote poverty, he had just wrote not having very much money instead of the word poverty.
We're still working on representations. We're still working on representations. I don't like. See, I'm trying here to stick to the paper and McCaskill and Singer. And at the same time, we have been not opening a discussion into other philosophers who have done what I have tried to do here in a much better way, if you will, or more effective way. But I'm not even going to introduce Marxism here. I'm not going to do it. But what I'm saying here is that ultimately, poverty relates to the possibilities of your body. Because even if let me try to address it differently. In order to make money, what do you have to do? Work.
I mean, not necessarily. You may own assets.
You may own assets, okay. But if you own assets, how are you going to use the money that you're making? What are you ultimately going to do?
I mean, spend it or invest it.
How can you? Yeah. How are you going to get the money?
How are you going to what?
Ultimately, everything will refer back to your body.
Well, wait, okay. I mean, that seems like kind of a trivial distinction. I
It's
mean,
not a trivial distinction. Is
well,
that it's
everything you do relates to your body in some sense. But that does
precisely
not mean that
okay? There we go. We have it. We're
right,
saying we
but,
have a
but that doesn't
syndrome.
mean but that does not mean that every word is synonymous with the body. It just means that
We
it
didn't
has a
say
meaning that relates to. I mean, this seems to be about the way he's using a word. I think that that's a semantic dispute.
this is a very restrictive way of looking at it, and if we the way that I'm trying to bring it on into the discussion and give it the gravity that it requires is because it's right here. When you simplify, I think it's just a word. We are ending up in the situations that I'm mentioning in the paper, because you simplify the words. It's just a word. It's not just a word, because it sacrifices the autonomy of a person. When you're just saying, for example, that poverty is not something that has to do with the body of a person because the person cannot move or cannot find a job or whatever you want to say, it ultimately goes back to the autonomy of the person, which is sacrificed by looking at poverty in representational terms.
No, because he's using it just to mean lack of money. He's not using it to mean anything relating to the body. But I mean,
And that's what the problem is. That's what the problem is essentially. It's because we are stuck in looking at poverty as lack of money.
But okay, when you're saying looking at poverty as lack of money, like, I mean, to the extent that you're criticizing, like looking at a word, we look at what the meaning is. We use a word in a particular way. This is the way that McCaskill is using it. Now, you may think that perhaps there's a better definition of poverty that we should still use instead, that we should use instead. But I mean, this is not a substantive disagreement if it's just he uses a word and you think that that definition is not good. But I mean, we've been going on this point.
I'm sorry. I will have to raise very many concerns here, because it's not. That's exactly the attitude that I see in McCaskill, which is very dangerous. Because if you just see that it's just like one word, that is like a definition, and it's a power dynamic here, unfortunately. Because it's not that innocent to say, for instance, that poverty is always has to do with money.
Well, if that's the way we're using the word, I mean, are you a linguistic?
Not about a word, because words are referring to life and ways of life.
Yeah, and you refer to a different thing with poverty than what McCaskill refers to with poverty. So when
and that's what the point I'm making is that because McCaskill is stuck in a definition of poverty which is representational.
Right. So you think poverty should be about the body. It's not the way McCaskill is using it.
I'm just saying that poverty.
We can leave that one up to the views of the listener, because I have some more questions. If you're good with moving on.
I'm good. I just want to underscore the importance of this idea of representing poverty in a particular way, because that's what I'm making point here, is that obviously if you represent poverty in a particular way, and I'm again underscoring the idea of representing poverty in a particular way, then in the way that effective altruist as McCaskill does, then it's dangerous to end up in this kind of situations.
I mean, what you're doing, okay, I know I said I was going to move on, but one more point before we move on. So, I mean, what you're doing with the word poverty, I could do it with any word that you're using. So you use the word represent. Well, what does represent mean? Well,
yes, let's go and say what represent means.
Right. So how did you use the word represent?
How I use the word represent. I'm using the word represent by being acknowledging the fact that it can disseminate into a multiplicity of meanings. Which
sure,
means,
but what meaning were you intending to convey with the word represent?
Is what I'm bring again into present view.
Okay, so bring into present view. Well,
even if that my intention is, that doesn't mean that I can control it. Even if my intention is that you use a word like that, it cannot be a closed in to the meanings that I want to.
Yeah, but surely our representations have to do with the representer and have to do with our bodies when we're using it to represent. And so I mean, I could levy the same criticism. Your uncritical use of the word represent neglects the focus on the body and papers over, a understanding what it means to represent things, but it's just not an interesting critique because it's just disagreeing with the way words are used.
I will invite that critique. Show me how, and let's do it better. Where exactly? I'm honest being here. If you think that I have like stuck to a particular representation of representation, if that's your point, let's gladly let's go and unpack it. What is what are the possibilities of meaning of representation? What have I done? Where have I restricted the representation of representation?
Well, you say that it means to bring into present light, but I mean, I don't know the etymology of the word represent, but I could surely give you historical examples of people using the word represent in a different way and then make some criticism of the way that it's used and something that focus neglects. And yet that's not a productive enterprise because the way that we use words is to communicate a concept. And if something was the common sense way of using a word, then I think that's the way we should use it.
Well, now we're moving into speculations, and I don't think that our discussion would like to go into speculations.
That's fine.
That's speculative part.
Yeah.
The case is here that the route that I'm trying to show is that here we have something which needs to be taken with seriousness, absolute seriousness. To accept, because if we uncritically accept what is being mentioned in McCaskill, then I'm sorry, but we have issues.
Yeah. So okay, I mean we've been going down that rabbit hole for a while, so we can move on to another thing. So you, in terms of the last quote, so you also make the point that effective altruists should focus on systemic change to capitalism, right? You make that position to figure out what way there is of lifting people out of poverty, and we need alternatives to capitalism to lift everyone out of poverty. So what alternative to capitalism do you advocate that's likely to be achievable in the next 10 to 15 years that can make people better off and is likely to be passable? Because if not, then it's just a pipe dream that advocating for won't make anyone better off in effective altruism. And I think more common sense morality says that we shouldn't just spend our money on pipe dreams that won't make people better off when there are children dying of malaria right
now. Again, I'm going to point into the fact that this is a critique.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm asking which and a critique in the sense is to be a discussion. I'm not here to my point and for writing this paper and also for a discussion is not to convince you about a particular point of view. That's not my point.
Sure. I mean, but
my point is to be able to open the discussion and the critique in order not to have the foreclosures and that kind of violence that you have with this kind of thinking that we see in Singer and McCaskill. I won't go into telling you a particular alternative to capitalism right now. I will tell you, I'll start by saying that capitalism right now sustains poverty. And charity, effective altruism, the way that they describe it, it's something that sustains a poverty. Poverty, which has to do with shackling people from not being able to self-actualize. Okay. Now, if we realize that then we can start another discussion about how this can be overcome. But first,
we
need to realize.
I agree we can start the discussion, but so let's have the discussion. What's the alternative? How do we bring it about? Because I mean, what you just said is that capitalism, as a result of capitalism, a bunch of people are in poverty. I mean, with capitalism, I won't take a stance for now on whether capitalism's net good or bad, but there's certainly some people who are in poverty in a world where there's capitalism. And yet, if there's not an alternative that's realizable, then we shouldn't advocate against it. So, I mean, also, like tornadoes put a lot of people into poverty. It would be absurd to advocate against effective altruism, because effective altruism takes tornadoes as a given and doesn't advocate for ways of getting rid of tornadoes. Because we generally think that tornadoes, while they're bad, they're not the most effective thing to focus on, and we don't have a good alternative. I think that focusing on getting rid of capitalism is not a very productive thing to focus on. There have been attempts to get rid of capitalism. They've generally failed. It would require far more resources than a small number of people can achieve, and a small number of effective altruists have prevented hundreds of have prevented millions of people or tens of millions of people from getting malaria. And so, I mean, Bill Gates, who's done largely effective altruist things, has saved 3 million lives. If everyone in EA became devoted to trying to overthrow capitalism, no one would be better off. But if everyone around the world became devoted to EA, we would solve world poverty in about a year. So, given that, why should we focus on?
Possibly we would solve extreme poverty, as McCaskill and Singer says, but we wouldn't solve poverty.
Sure, I mean, but if we focused on anti-capitalist movements, like let's say that 10% of the U.S. populace became vehemently opposed to capitalism, do you think that would end capitalism in the U.S.?
I'm not into the position to go into this kind of speculations about what will happen tomorrow.
Well, but I mean,
I'm not trying to predict and control, because this is not as I said, I'm not in the framework of prediction and control. In the sense, because I have a different approach to life, but what I'm saying here is again a critique.
Sure, but
hold on a second.
Okay.
And the critique is this, and I think it was made, it has to be made. I know that we have stuck into particular instances of the paper, and I'm also risking misinterpretations of the paper, because we are stuck in doing particular pieces without having to follow the flow, as I did with Singer and McCaskill. I didn't take instances of their arguments. I followed them through from the beginning to the end, which we haven't done for my paper. But I'm happy to take this risk and to bear the consequences for that. But here the point is that insofar as the representation of poverty is done with money, effective altruism, and any kind of charity, somebody could risk the hypothesis, will always be their crutch. The crutch to capitalism. Why? Because you can ask yourself, what would the meaning of charity be if there wasn't any non-representational poverty? I'm asking you this question so you can understand what I'm trying to say. What would the meaning of charity, of any kind of charity for that sense? I'm again risking the possibility of opening the question. What meaning would the charity have? Meaning, and that question is not mine. Baudelaire has analyzed it better than I have. But let's say, what would the meaning of charity be if there was no poverty, in the sense, as you say, that I'm representing it in this paper?
I mean, I think
it means not in non-monetary terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think charity would become largely useless if there was no. I mean, there would still be some uses, surely, and certain things that could be donated. But charity to combat extreme poverty and to combat poverty would be eliminated if there was no more poverty. But I mean, that's an absurd standard for determining if something is something that we should focus.
I don't think it's absurd. This is where the crutch of the problem lies. If charity is required only when there are haves and the have-nots, then you can understand that the relation here between charity, or the effective altruist representational charity, is something that has to be scrutinized further. But apart from that, surely something that we haven't touched upon, so we can clarify. Because we need to clarify this. My paper works on the philosophical ground of effective altruism, not on the practical round. Okay, I made it clear in the paper that because I'm following another philosopher who has make that point very clearly, and that is, let me remind myself about the point. Jennifer Rubinstein has done an amazing work in trying to clarify that there are many ways that you can go about in terms of this movement. What I'm trying here is to do a philosophical critique, not a practical critique. I'm also mentioning in the paper that obviously I don't say that effective altruists might not be helping people practically. That's not my point. Now, whether this is effective or not requires criteria. Now, the criteria can never be objective. My point in the paper is the philosophical ground, which we haven't touched at all in our discussion.
Yeah. So, okay. I mean, so in terms of what you said about how, like, if we didn't have people in poverty, there would be no need for efforts like effective altruism focuses on to combat extreme poverty. So I have a question for you. Do you think that it's a productive use of time to focus on finding alternatives to capitalism that lift people out of poverty? Assuming there was an easy way of doing that, do you think we should focus on figuring out ways of lifting the world out of poverty, if there was a way of lifting the world out of poverty?
And that will, in order to answer that question, I will have to first of all inquire you about more existential themes, like why do we live and what's the meaning of our life that we're trying to pursue.
Well, okay. I mean, that seems like an issue that we needn't get into. But I mean, it seems clear that if there was an easy way of ending poverty around the world, like an alternative to capitalism that was easy, could be easily implemented, that would end world poverty, it would be a good thing to do that, correct? I mean, that just seems common sense.
I don't know what common sense is, because
I think most people would agree with it.
Well, even all the people of the world would agree with that, and that would be common. That doesn't make it so. If you want to use the logic of,
it gives us an inductive reason to believe it. But okay,
common sense also, as you said, the most people is again another point that I'm making in the paper. What is something that is common and the most people believe? A representational or a utilitarian way of looking at things. So we have here a circular reasoning, representational poverty with representational way of thinking. So that's what I'm trying to make in the paper. There's again in another way. It's like a circular way around.
Sure. I mean, okay. So let's just pretend for a moment that if there was an easy way of ending world poverty, we would want to do it. I mean, I assumed you would agree with that. I guess that's not, but let's just pretend that we do for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
After we end world poverty, movements to end world poverty are no longer necessary. And yet that doesn't mean that before we end world poverty, movements are no longer necessary. I mean, like this critique reads to the criticism that if there was no capitalist poverty, then there would be no need for effective altruism. Reads to me as, if things were different, then your movement would no longer be needed. Well, okay, but things aren't different. And so our movement is needed, and the movement has saved millions of lives and is a productive thing that we should spend time and energy on, especially when the alternatives that you give to capitalism, you can't identify a good alternative to capitalism. You just point out that effective altruism accepts capitalism. But the world that we're living in right now is a world of capitalism. And so unless we can figure out ways of making a better alternative to capitalism, we shouldn't pretend that things that are not the case are the case. And instead we should focus on pragmatic ways of improving the quality of life of people around the world. And I think that's what effective altruism philosophically says that we should do.
I'm happy with what you said, but what I'm stressing in my paper, that is like flagging and saying, like, if you want to work this way, because that's how Singer wants to work, or like because again, Singer is different than McCaskill like this. McCaskill has a little bit of ignorance in terms of what is going on or has been going on in terms of historical perpetuation of capitalism and what has led to it. But Singer, who is acknowledging and very, 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 very firm in terms of saying staunchly, that's what I believe, that's what I want. And that's how, like, it's, I want to work with this to make it a better way of living. I'm saying, fine, you, in simple terms, in an everyday language, I say, like, you can do that, but don't be disillusioned that you're helping the poor. You're keeping them shackled in their poverty, in their actual poverty, in their non-representational poverty. Because I'll tell you this, since we are in a deity defeater channel, there's a quote from Christianity that says that it has to do with the fish and the fisherman. You can give fish to people and you will satisfy their hunger, but teach them how to fish, and then you won't need to do anything else. The whole point of this quote in the scripture is that when you empower someone and you allow them to learn something and be able to do it by themselves, then you give them their autonomy. You grant them your autonomy. But if you are giving them charity, as in with the fish, you're enslaving them. This is not something that I'm saying as new Okay, here we are facing with a different aspect of the dialectic of the master and the slave. Here always be the poor will always be contingent and conditioned on the person who will give them the representation of poverty salvation, for instance, the life preserver, as I say. So my point is that I'm not saying don't give to charity. That's not my point in this paper at all. I'm not saying don't give. I'm not saying give. I'm not saying what to do. I'm not making a normative claim. I'm saying that insofar, if you want, it's a transcendental claim, if anything. The conditions of what we're doing is that don't be disillusioned that when you give to charity, you feel better and that's it, and you're helping. No, you're not. At the same time, you're helping, you're also enslaving. But this, in order to be able to understand this kind of way, somebody needs to think beyond the principle of non-contradiction. You have to see life as not something that could be put in binary terms, either this or that. Insofar as you give to charity, since charity is, as you mentioned and you agreed, something that is required in capitalism in order to alleviate the conditions, the consequences of capitalism, then you're sustaining capitalism as well. And you're sustaining poverty as well.
Okay, so all right, so you point out that you say that it's shackling the poor and not making the poor truly better off. It's just making them independent. This is, I think, the empirical literature shows overwhelmingly that this is incorrect. Efforts that are funded by the Against Malaria Foundation, by effective altruism, do result in improvements of the quality of life of people and do result in these broad systemic social changes. So, for example, you talk about, give a man fish and he'll eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. So, well, one thing, if a man dies of malaria, then he's less likely to be able to fish for a lifetime. To finish the point, if a person has an education, then they're far more likely to be able to be lifted out of extreme poverty. And the quality of life of people is far higher when they have an education, and it makes it so that they're less dependent. The most effective way of improving educational outcomes, according to rigorous studies, is not distributing textbooks. It's not other forms of aid. The most effective way is deworm the world initiatives, which are things funded by the effective altruist organization. It turns out that a major reason why people don't get an adequate education is because they have intestinal worms that afflict them that make it difficult for them to get an education. So if we want to improve people's education, which effective altruism does, then we should do things like deworm the world. And every $5 can prevent one person from having heinous intestinal worms that make their life far worse. If we want systemic reforms that improve people's quality of life, then we should do effective altruist things that improve people's quality of life. However, in terms of the claim that it's not helping, again, I think the empirical literature clearly disproved this claim. There was a meta-analysis that I read recently. I'm forgetting the name of the author. The author was Torp in 2018, who looked at all of the studies and found that they overwhelmingly conclude that foreign aid improves the quality of life. It doesn't shackle people. It doesn't make them dependent. It makes them less dependent because they're no longer in poverty. Karnofsky also finds that even those who critiqued foreign aid, like William Easterly, like Angus Deaton, like Dambisa Moyo, agree that the effective altruist forms of foreign aid are good for people overseas. They criticize efforts that make people dependent on the United States and on Westerners, but even the critics of foreign aid agree that what effective altruism does in terms of distributing bed nets overseas, helping out cure people of intestinal worms, improve people's quality of life. You say that charity is needed to help capitalism. Why? I don't know a reason to think that claim is true. I think that when a lot of people are poor overseas, that does not bring about the collapse of capitalism. I also don't think we have a reason to think that the end of capitalism is a good thing, and that you have no desirable alternative that you think is better than capitalism. When people are better able to bring about systemic changes to capitalism, they're not dying of malaria. And yet, currently, many people are dying of malaria. And I think that the notion that capitalism is just some static thing where we cannot improve the quality of life people under a capitalist economy is obviously bogus. The billions of people have been lifted out of poverty in the past several decades as a result of largely of capitalist economies. And so regardless of whether capitalism is on net good or bad, there are better and worse forms of capitalism. And I think a far worse form of capitalism is one where a child dies of malaria in horrendous pain.
I will say this as a starter, from Wittgenstein. If someone is convinced that mice can come out of a rug, they will make everything they want to do in order to prove that this is the case. Now, having been an empirical researcher myself in communication science, I will when you tell me about empirical evidence, I cannot make a claim until I see the methodology of the quantification that has been done. And I think Quine would have agreed with me in terms of the quantification of how it's done, and needs to be seen in terms of how what quantify as quality of life. Now, obviously, there's this huge discrepancy and a general belief that particular ways of life has been proved because of that, and McCaskill says that in his book, and which is also common sense and common knowledge, if you will, and then overabundant literature claims that supposedly that we have a better average life now than before or with capitalism. And that is absolutely a very, very isolated, solipsistic, westernized view, which is not the case in the Mediterranean world in ancient times. And you can find the evidence in the literature. But I'm not going to go there just now. I'm going to say that what I'm asking in this paper, and this is a critique that is not only I was motivated to this critique from other also authors who you haven't mentioned, because I don't want to take I don't want to take the, let's say, the credit for being a unique in this kind of critique. Obviously, if I want to justify what I'm doing, is that I'm just bringing together some critiques that have been done in from other points and bringing them together in this paper. But going back to your point, the conditions of the people who have malaria, I would suggest, for instance, to see narratives from the people who are who have been suffering, because we haven't heard them. I haven't seen any research saying from the people from malaria or from the East Bengal, and that's another point I'm making in the paper, and that's another point that I'm making following the feminist critique, is that we interpret the other as another of the same, which means that we interpret the other based on how we think that the other is. We don't allow them to speak. Now, the conditions of those people who have malaria that you're claiming now, or they had before, or the conditions of poverty, is another point that I'm making. It's not something that's happening because of, again, we're going back to this idea of some kind happening. It happened. It's not impersonal. This is there's some kind of historical precedence here that must be accounted for. Obviously, I'm not saying that if you rob me just now, and then 10 weeks later you come and say, "Oh, I'm giving you charity." Yes, of course you will be giving me, and if you test and if you and make a research about the effects that you will and the quality of life that you will improve by giving me back what you took from me. Yes, of course, they will be the case, but and it will be exactly as you say. But shouldn't we see history here?
Yeah. Okay. So, you said that that the improvements in quality of life isolated by people like McCaskill are isolated and neglect places like the Mediterranean. They look at a holistic view of people around the world. They conclude that people's quality of life is going up on a variety of metrics. Fewer people are in poverty, more people have adequate education, fewer people are dying of starvation, the criminal justice system is more just, there are fewer extrajudicial killings, etc. There have been studies on this. They've concluded decisively that the quality of life of people around the world are getting better. You say you're bringing together multiple critiques. Sure. I mean, I'm explaining why I'm not convinced by those critiques. You say that that effective altruism neglects the voices of the people who are suffering. I think that's not correct. I think effective altruism looks at the voices of the people who are suffering and concludes that and looks at the best ways of helping them. I think we know that people who are dying of malaria generally don't want to die of malaria. And we know from empirical literature that efforts like the Against Malaria Foundation's efforts like the efforts from the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative improve the quality of life of people. Because when people are afflicted by intestinal worms, their quality of life is significantly lower. I think that the critique that your criticism would apply more to non-effective altruist forms of charity, because non-effective altruist forms of charity look at what feels good to us rather than what's overall good for improving the quality of life of people around the world. And only effective altruism actually looks at if the things make people better off.
I think we will go round and round again in the same point, because you have, just like effective altruists, you believe that you can know what is the best for these people from an objective point of view without asking them, because supposedly you can arrive at that without asking them.
You think effective altruism doesn't ask the people what they want the most? I mean, one of the core tenets of effective altruism, as explained by Asmodeus, is that effective altruism cares a lot about autonomy. It looks at what people say they want. It explicitly criticizes efforts like the not Venezuelan, the blanking on the name of the country, but the hand pumps that were sent with the it would take a while to explain exactly what the story is, but effective altruists look at what the people say that they want and then generally do what people say they want. For example, people say that they want malaria.
Allow me to intervene again, and I'm saying I'm not here to discuss. I wasn't here to discuss the practical ways of how people go about to give charity. That's not my concern.
Well, I mean, I think that is the main concern of effective altruism and the main thing that it advocates.
You can. I am in my paper. I'm saying, and there's a claim that I'm making that the philosophical foundation of effective altruism, and that is made clear how they're muted they are with respect to how they are analogized with Singer as children.
Well, okay.
Hold on a second, let me finish. And then for the practical ways that people go, I can claim myself to be an effective altruist and start giving money and helping people. That's fine. I'm not saying to anybody, don't do that or do it. I'm just saying that insofar as you do it, you're sustaining the conditions which led to these people being in this condition that they are.
Yeah, so I don't think...
I want to clarify this. Insofar as you're doing it, that's why it's a critique, a phenomenological, if you will, critique of what's going on, is that insofar as you're doing this, don't be disillusioned that you're saving them from poverty. You are also saving them, you are saving them from one type of poverty. Okay, and then... because where poverty is, I didn't say at one point in my paper say for the things about medicine. I do say in my paper that effective altruisms do actually do that, and they help people because medicine is a different issue here.
Yeah. So okay.
That's a different issue. I do mention and I don't think that you gave me credit for that. If I may be a little bit of a tease here, because I did mention in one of my footnotes that. Let me see where exactly it is, because it's been so long that I wrote this paper and I hadn't had a chance to prepare for the paths that I followed here. So I do say that effective altruism with giving well, or was it give directly, or these things that they have do talk about helping people, because the issue about the medicine is different. And that's what another point of logic here needs to be addressed, is that when you help someone from malaria, for example, as you say, it's wading in and pulling out. Fine. This is not the same with the poverty, because the problem of the problem of malaria, as you say, you give them a vaccine, okay, and you solve the problem. Now, whether you eradicate the problem and whether we can ever eradicate something, I won't go there because this is a dangerous term. But let's say you allow them to not be affected by this problem. Okay, you do. And I do say that in my paper with respect to medicine and other things that they give. Yes, absolutely. Good with that. And let's celebrate that. I wouldn't say no. But when it comes to talking about poverty, okay, and then another discussion needs to be had whether the malaria and the other medical conditions are by themselves something that happened again out of luck, or are the conditions of being in situations that capitalism has sustained from in the long run. I'm just saying that don't be disillusioned that you are helping them in terms of poverty. You are to a certain extent, but to a certain extent also sustaining the system that led them to be there.
Okay, so to finish where I left off. So you gave the analogy a few minutes ago of if you like rob someone and then later you give them a present. The robbing them part is bad, but if you already robbed them, surely it would be better to give them a present than not to give them a present. And you would agree that the robbing already happened via. No, I mean, if I robbed you, wouldn't you rather I give you a present later than not give you a present later? It would obviously be better that I didn't rob you, but I mean, effective altruists are not currently plundering the global South. So I don't think that applies. You say that we should distrust empirics to some degree. Yeah, we should be somewhat skeptical of empirics, but the empirical literature is so overwhelming that effective altruist forms of aid work that I think it's very clear. Even the critics of effective altruism, even William Easterly, who wrote The White Man's Burden, who was maybe one of the staunchest critics of foreign aid of the 20th century, Easterly agrees that this form of aid is good. Angus Deaton agrees the form of aid is good, who's another prominent critic. Tembiso Moyo agrees that this form of aid is good, just criticizes other form of aid. TARP did a meta-analysis where TARP looked at every single study and concluded that they overwhelmingly show that quote, the new and updated results show that the previously reported positive evidence of AID's impact is robust to the inclusion of more recent studies. And this holds for different time horizons as well. The authenticity of the observed effect is further confirmed by results from funnel plots, regression-based tests, and a cumulative meta-analysis for publication bias. Orange found the same thing in a 2015 paper. And Karnofsky found another thing. In fact, Karnofsky concluded that the rare papers that say that foreign aid is bad generally don't apply to the effective altruism aid for a few reasons. One, they generally focus on government-to-government aid programs rather than organizations that provide direct aid to people. Second, they fail to account for the number of people affected and the time elapsed. Third, they don't look at the effective programs, such as the ones that eradicated smallpox, which would have a cost effectiveness of one life saved for every $40,000. And fourth, what TARP finds is that the more recent studies that with better methodologies overwhelmingly conclude foreign aid is good. So the claim that it shackles the poor and leaves people in more poverty and sustains capitalism and is overall net harmful is just wrong according to all of the empirical literature. And we should have some distrust of empirical literature, but to have this level of distrust of empirical literature would lead you to epistemic nihilism and would lead you to distrust every single conclusion from every study. I mean, the evidence is.
I'm sorry to say this, but it's not wrong. First of all, because we're moving into like from you're moving me into philosophical to empirical ground, and I told you again, if you want to argue about something and about something in terms of like, as I said with Wittgenstein earlier, if you are convinced that something is the case, you will do everything it is in order to prove it. Now, the empirical evidence, again, I'm telling you, I cannot say anything about the empirical evidence until I see the methodology that it has been done. Things that have been done in empirical evidence. Having done empirical research myself and very scientific, because I'm trained in that as well as a communication scientist, allow me to have my reservations in terms of how quantification is done, how the statistics are done, and everything. Now, apart from that, again, I'm going again to the part that we can have arguments about the whether this is working or whether this is not working with empirical evidence. This is not. This is just like another dialectic which is working, and I'm not falling into the trap of capitalism, of competition, of other thing, of representationalism. Because again, the thinking that you're trying to tell me to go through is that the majority of the empirical evidence are overwhelming into the stuff. We're still working with representationalism. I don't know if you can see that we're still working with representationalism. We're still stuck in representationalism. Whereas my point in the paper is that I agree in principle with Singer. In principle, yes, I agree. But what I'm saying is that requires another economy in the inceptual meaning of the word, in the Greek word of the word economy, which means another distribution of ways of dealing with the world, which will not lead to some people being haves and some other people being have-nots. Now,
Okay.
whether this is something feasible or not, I don't think that hello?
Oh, that was my bad. Sorry. I accidentally removed myself from the stream.
I felt lonely for a bit, I have to say. I thought I was abandoned, like the kid in the drowning pond. I'm saying that whether it's feasible or not to move into a different economy is up to us. If we can mobilize a whole enterprise of effective altruism, can we not mobilize an equal, let's say, project, if you will, of finding alternative ways? But that's what I'm saying in the paper as well. But effective altruists here are dogmatic because they are stuck again into a particular way of thinking, which is the mathematical logic.
Okay. So you say we can mobilize an alternative to capitalism.
I'm asking. It was just a proposal to be put into the table of discussion. By the way, can I ask something? Is it possible to have a 5-minute recess in order to have like a little bit of a refresher? Is that not possible? Just for toilet reasons.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, that's fine.
If that's possible. Okay. Yeah. Can I pause somehow my?
Yeah, I can remove you from the stream, and then I can have five unbridled minutes to influence the audience.
Now, this is a charity that I have to say that you are giving me as a host, and I will gladly take, and it's crucial for my well-being. So I'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
All right. I don't want to be doing a Hegelian instantiation of the master and slave relation. It's just development.
I'll be back in 5 minutes.
Well, all right, everyone. So he's going to be back in 5 minutes. I think, my problem with most of this is these are sort of very abstract, vague things about the rhetoric and the dialogue used by effective altruists and individual sentences and the ideology that it presupposes. But if we look at the fundamental details and we look at the on-the-ground facts, effective altruists are doing a large amount of good. They're lifting hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. They're preventing millions of people from getting malaria. They're preventing tens or hundreds of thousands of people from dying of malaria. They're preventing massive numbers of people from getting intestinal worms that negatively afflict them, which is the best way of improving educational outcomes. They're increasing the amount of remittances that are done. Overall, effective altruism has done a massive amount to improve the world. And we shouldn't dismiss these out of a criticism of words used by effective altruists when effective altruists are doing are lifting huge numbers of people out of poverty. It seems clear that effective altruism is doing a lot of good. The effective altruist, I just found the numbers. Bed net distribution done largely by effective altruists has prevented 450 million cases of malaria. Malaria is a horrendous disease. If you were one of the 450 million people who didn't get malaria, you would be thankful for the intervention. And we should not dismiss an intervention as good as this one on the basis of rhetoric being used by the people who do it, because we think that the words can be used in different ways. I think that the systemic critique that EAs don't focus on systemic reform is just wrong. EAs often do focus on systemic reform. They just look at what systemic reform is the most effective. For example, Nick Cooney of the Humane League is an effective altruist who did systemic reform and got McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts, General Mills, Costco, Sodexo, and many more to adopt cage-free policies. Lincoln Quirk reduced the costs of remittances dramatically, which is desirable given that remittances provide far more money overseas than foreign aid flows. Scott Weathers lobbies for the Reach Every Mother and Child Act, which would allow U.S. aid to look for evidence before spending money overseas. Effective altruists have also pushed for criminal justice reform. But the distinction is that unlike other movements, we look for systemic reforms that actually work rather than ones that make us feel cool and radical. Institutions like capitalism don't go away on a whim, and we can't just wish them away or make them disappear by changing the way that we use words. And so we should focus on the ways that we can make people better off. And effective altruism gives effective ways of making people better off. And so I think it's a good idea. In terms of the distinction over the way McCaskill used poverty, I think that was clearly semantic. It was about how he used a word, not a productive discussion about the meanings of words when a person is using a word correctly in correspondence with the meaning that they chose. All right. Hercules has returned.
I kind of was listening because I had the sound on about what you were saying. Not my disagreement, but my reservation and my caution would be: it's not about meanings of the words, and if we leave it at that, it's dangerous.
Yeah,
because
okay.
we forget the historical. We forget the historical. Let's say a succession of things, and if you're stuck only in the presence, that's why I said again earlier that we're stuck in the metaphysics of presence and presentationalism, then we won't be as effective as we think that we are. And
yeah.
again,
we went on that issue.
It's not just semantics. It's not just semantics. But apart from that, I was all looking at the paper, and I do mention again. I will mention it. I'm not critiquing effective altruism on its practical unfolding. I'm saying that at one point I'd say that if it was possible to have a complete and adequate application of the philosophy into practice, if that were possible, which is not, still you will see that since the theory lacks, or like the theory leads you to a dead end, somehow the practical will also lead you to some kind of difficulties. Now, obviously, you're presenting effective altruism as if the only ever charity that was ever on the planet of the universe. The cases about malaria and medicine and all that kind of stuff. Allow me to say, I'm 41 years old, and when I was in high school, I remember that UNICEF saying, like, buy notebooks and say, to get the vaccines to people, to kids who were in Africa and other places, and I did that as well. I'm not saying I'm not judging about the medicine aspect of charity here again, and I'm stressing that because there's one thing about the medicine and one thing about the poverty. They're not the same. Effective altruism tactically draws three different categories, and I make that claim in the paper in the beginning, trying to collapse these categories, and they shouldn't be collapsed.
Okay, yeah. So to continue the responses to the things you were saying. So the example of UNICEF, So you say that that you're disagreeing with the philosophy, not the practicality. I mean, but I think that your philosophical critique is that effective altruism props up capitalism in some way and assumes capitalism, which is in a sense a practical argument about the structures that it improves and that it sustains. And so if it doesn't improve that structures, then I think those structures, then I think the force of the critique goes away. I mean, if you agree with the poverty with the malaria bed net distribution and such, well, then I think you agree with most of effective altruism, given that of their top 14 charities, I think 13 of them are focused on global health and development. Only one of them is Give Directly, which focuses on giving money directly. The others focus on improving health outcomes. You say that things like malaria are caused by capitalism. I mean, that's a controversial claim that we could get into, and we could discuss whether capitalism is good. But even if capitalism is the cause of it, the question is not what caused it, but what's the solution. As Fods points out in an article, it is quite, he says, quote, "It is quite plausible. Indeed, I think history indicates overwhelmingly probable that even if all EAs on the planet, and 10 times more than that number, denounce the evils of capitalism in as loud and shrill voices as they could muster, that nothing of any substance would change to the benefit of the world's poor. As such, if our main objective is to actually help people rather than indulge in our own intellectual prejudices by attributing all evil in the world to the boogeyman of capital, then it's perfectly reasonable to implore individuals to use their money to procure necessities for those who desperately need them, rather than saying something about the system that determines how the necessities are produced." I mean, I think that the historical track record is clear that we've tried to figure out ways of getting rid of capitalism. They generally haven't worked very well. And movements, there are a lot of movements that try to get rid of capitalism, and they have not done very much good. Effective altruism has prevented 450 million people from getting malaria. And I think that that's a more important good than allowing us to historically analyze the cause of capitalism. I mean, I think the empirical literature is clear, things are getting better. And so if capitalism is somewhat inevitable, then, I mean, it's silly to try to end capitalism when you don't have an alternative. It makes no more sense to try to get rid of capitalism than it does to try to get rid of the weather. Because while both of them push people into poverty, if they're inevitable and there's no alternative, then we shouldn't try to get rid of them. In terms of
Can I answer to that? So
yeah.
that we don't lose the many questions that you pose here. Again, I'm saying I wouldn't collapse the categories of poverty and medicine. And you're saying that if you're talking about causes, what caused the problem? Again, we're stuck in a metaphysics discourse. In a classical metaphysics discourse about causality, as if it's possible to isolate things like that, which we do, unfortunately, because that's the mainstream way of thinking and of Western scientific way of thinking, is that kind of like Aristotelian inspired and Platonic inspired way of thinking, which have carried on. Now, my thinking was conditional, transcendental. What are the conditions for poverty? What are the conditions for a particular problem? Now, for malaria, it will be debatable because, again, you will have to assume a particular set of beliefs, and I don't ascribe to biologism in order to be able to answer that question, because that requires a different kind of discussion. But apart from that, the point that I'm trying to make again is that you cannot just scrap okay, that's the problem, and what's the solution? Because you're in danger of being ahistorical is a dangerous thing, and that's what is something that I'm saying to Sinker and McCaskill as well, because that way of being ahistorical, or in the sense of neglecting what happened in the previous times, might be repeated in the future. Now, this is something to be reckoned with. Because if you don't know that, for instance, capitalism is conditioned on appropriating and expropriating and reappropriating the other, then you will immediately forget what this has entailed. And then obviously you will working within the system of alleviating the bad effects, as Singer says. Singer is honest in his critique. He's a capitalist. He doesn't say that he wants to get out of this. He says that we're stuck with that, and I like that, and I'm trying to make this better, a better capitalism. That's why he says clearly. He's honest. I agree with Singer on that, and I do like reading about the fact that he says that I'm stuck to that. and I like that, and I want to eradicate extreme poverty. He's careful in what he says. Extreme poverty. He doesn't say poverty because he knows that he cannot eradicate poverty with capitalism. McCaskill is a different story.
Okay, I mean, I think that poverty has been decreasing around the world, like billions of people have been lifted out of extreme poverty, and tens or hundreds of millions have been lifted out of poverty generally. Barnes, in a study, finds that capitalism has lifted about 1 billion people out of poverty. 20 years, capitalism empirically prevents wars. I mean, like,
how paradoxically this sounds. But see how
generally
paradoxically this sounds. Like paradoxically, in the sense not of a logical contradiction in that sense, in the actual contradiction, which means contradictum of itself, because capitalism, which is some people have and some people have not, which is the condition of poverty. Capitalism is the condition of poverty.
I don't think capitalism is the condition of poverty.
In its broader sense, capitalism, when somebody wants to invest and get more of what they can actually require in life. I'm talking about in a wider sense of capitalism. Again, in its conceptual meaning, which you will accuse me of being in semantics, but for me, it's more like about like going into the possibilities of meaning. Capitalism has reduced the amount of poverty. For me, that is a joke.
Well, I mean, it may be a joke for you, but like
it's a paradoxical and oxymoronic joke. So, like, you cannot. We will have to go back to maybe a little bit of Marxist writings to see how much capitalism has conditioned into creating the kind of poverty that we're discussing here. The representational poverty.
Do you agree that? Do you agree that there were people in poverty before capitalism, like under feudalism, for example?
Again, as I said, I'm using the term capitalism in the broadest sense possible.
So, what's your definition of capitalism?
If you capitalism, the condition of capitalism is property.
Wait, so capitalism is defined as property?
No, I didn't say that.
So how do we define capitalism?
The essential. I'm not giving definitions of things as you.
Well, then I don't know what. Then I don't know what you mean by capitalism.
I'm telling you, is the way of things come together where someone has something and someone else does not. One is at the expense of another.
Wait, that's your definition of capitalism, for some people to have stuff and other people not to have stuff?
I said again that I'm using capitalism in the broadest sense possible.
Okay, but is that your definition of capitalism?
You're asking me to do something which I'm telling you that I don't want to do.
Okay. I mean, if you're gonna say,
you understand what I'm saying. You understand what I'm saying.
I mean, I do. I think that capitalism, you're just using it as a vague Barnum statement to refer to bad things. And so, to refer to people being poor and others being rich. And I mean, if that's all you mean, then you're not criticizing the economic system that even Marxists mean by capitalism, where capital owners own the means of production. You're criticizing.
There we go. Owns. What did I say earlier? Property.
Well, yeah, so you used words that also appear in the definition. So wait, are you good with the definition of capitalism we're using being an economic system where owners of capital own the means of production? Are you fine with that definition?
Well, I'm fine insofar as we explain what we mean by economic.
Okay, but the question was,
not representational again.
Okay,
I will always disturb and displace a representation which comes to be normative, habitual, to the point of seeming real, as I'm critiquing in the paper. Because
but I don't want to talk past each other, so I want a good definition of capitalism. I've given one that's used by Marxists and capitalists alike. Are you fine with that definition, or do you disagree with that definition of capitalism?
We can work with that definition insofar as we allow economic to go back to the inceptual meaning of distribution of resources for one's a sustainability or self-actualization, if you will.
Okay, but the definition I gave doesn't use the word economic.
You said an economic system, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, okay. Scratch the word economic. A system in which which owners of capital own the means of production.
A system in which
an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. That's what Google says.
Okay, well, you know what? Let's go with that. But I'm reserving my right to refer to the economic and political in their conceptual meanings. But let's go with that.
Well, okay. I mean, if you're reserving your right to do that, then it's no longer a definition, because if whenever I make a point about that system, then you use the word to mean a different thing, then that's just an equivocation. But I mean,
it's not an equivocation. It's exactly what I'm trying to show you is that the kind of like the kind of trying to define something to foreclose some kind of situation. You restrict the autonomy of that thing and the freedom of something. And that's why I want us to be able to open this up. And that's a kind of like performativity issue that I'm trying to bring in our discussion in order to be able to see how this also plays out with effective altruism.
Great.
Because if we define poverty in our own terms, if we define something in our own terms without bringing the other into the discussion.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you have an alternative that you think is better than that economic system than capitalism?
An alternative economic system other than capitalism? It will depend again. Historically, we have.
Okay, what's the alternative?
Other ways of exchanging goods or distributing goods that one requires for their self-actualization. We do have historically. Again, I cannot propose you a particular system, because I'm not here to establish an economic system based on my particular existential views.
Okay, so I mean, if you can't give an alternative, and every time in the past when we've tried alternatives to capitalism, it's generally failed, and capitalism has lifted billions of people out of poverty, then, I mean...
That is a claim that is not true. If you want to go by truthfulness as correctness in terms of like historical, let's say, and a historical appreciation.
Which claim?
What do you mean that we have tried? Obviously, in ancient times, they didn't have capitalism. In that sense, like, using the word, or they did have property, but at some points they exercised the possibility of not having property. There are other cultures in the world that don't have a system of property in the way that we have it, which leads to capitalism. May I actually? I will refer to you to the research that is done by Marcel Mauss that I'm quoting in this paper, who was an anthropologist, who was also in the way that in the empirical let's say criteria that you would accept as valid, and I'm using that, where he says that there's a system of exchange of goods, which is not let's say conditioned on creating profits. Excuse me, or to lead to that kind of accumulation of goods, because everything is passed from one to the other. It's called the gift. It's an economy of the gift, an economy of reciprocity. And Marcel Mauss, who is also sorry about that, who is also talking about gifts. If I'm allowed to drink some water, because I'm starting to have that kind of research has never gone into the effective altruist radar, because it doesn't adhere, it doesn't fit into the epistemic norms that they accept.
I think it does. I mean, effective altruists have considered alternatives to capitalism, but generally concluded that they're not practical and that it's not clear that they're
Based on the
better.
criteria, that's the point that I'm making in the paper, based on the criteria that they have set. But the criteria that they have set, it's them who set them.
Yeah, I mean, but the criterion that they've set is being the best way of improving the well-being of conscious creatures.
You cannot say that. You cannot make that claim.
Why?
You cannot make it, because it's a claim that you make is the best way. Says who? I'll tell you. I'll take
well,
it more.
We do cost-benefit analyses and then compare different ways and conclude that some ways are better than others. You have no reason to think that your method of proposing alternatives to capitalism will result in making people better off. We've tried ways of getting rid of capitalism, like the Soviet Union tried it. Yugoslavia tried it. A bunch of countries have tried it, and it generally has not worked out so well for them. And that's so unless
a lullaby that we have used in order to be able to feel ourselves better, just like effective altruism is saying that it's helping others when they're actually helping themselves, in the sense of having a meaning, as we said earlier. So we can create narratives that can make us feel better to rationalize rationalize things. But
this isn't based on narratives. I mean, economists and historians are in overwhelming agreement about this, about the desirability of capitalism. There are a bunch of problems with non-capitalist economic systems, which is why they have not worked as well when capitalism has lifted billions of people out of poverty.
They haven't worked based on what? What is the criteria here, the ultimate criterion here that we set in order to be able to say that something that doesn't work? Because if you're making an evaluative statement about something not working, you always presuppose some criteria that you will judge whether something is working or not. If I want to say for obviously for that criteria that the people said, they might not be working. But what are the criteria? We need to go back into that kind of notion of reason that we were talking earlier. And the singer was talking about a life that doesn't have meaning, because when you start critiquing things, you come to the point of like, why do I do this? What's the point of this? And what is my ultimate point of doing things, which are more existential issues that need to be first resolved? Because if those are not resolved, we're going to be disillusioned.
Yeah. I mean, I think that regardless of what your criterion of value is, people starving to death is bad. A lot of people have starved to death in countries that have tried to transition away from capitalism. But under capitalism, billions of people have been lifted out of poverty. There's a linear correlation between the level of economic freedom, the level of capitalism, and economic growth and quality of life of people. So I generally think that trying to get rid of capitalism, we have no viable alternative, no reason to think that it'll work, and a plethora of historical examples of it failing every time, which is why most economists and historians agree that it's bad, and a series of problems of alternative economic systems to capitalism. I think we shouldn't invest all our energy and time in these alternatives when we can invest it in making people better off right now, making it so that the children in the shallow pond don't die, to use Singer's analogy, making it so that people right now don't die of malaria. I mean, just to unpack some of the problems with alternative economic systems to capitalism. So you have the calculation problem, which is that absent a market system, it's very difficult to figure out how much of stuff to produce, because the market is a natural regulating system that uses price signal, supply and demand, et cetera. But absent that, I mean, there's not a good way of doing it. You have the problem of inadequate incentives for labor. If people aren't paid for their labor, then they won't adequately labor. And so you have to coerce them, which results in a series of problems. There's the problem raised by Schleifer and someone in Schleifer and their 91 paper, which said that central planning creates incentives for the creation of shortages so that officials can collect bribes and cited empirical evidence. I mean, there are like a lot of problems with non-capitalist systems, and we shouldn't hand wave away efforts to make the world better because there are still problems under capitalism when the alternatives are worse and unachievable.
I acknowledge reception of what you said. I think we are going here into an incompossible area, because if you're saying that and you're making claims like they're better, they are worse, based on the criteria, it sounds like, as Nietzsche says sometimes, that we are weaving, like spiders, we are weaving our own webs, and we think that we are having something which is objective in the end. But apart from that, I will remind you that we have to be careful with research. we have to be careful with research because historically, it's a research that was trying to define things like inferiority and superiority of races, sexes, and other things that we tried now to challenge. Okay, now this goes into the point that you made earlier about the empirical overwhelming abundance. And I'm going back to the feminist critique because it was up until to the 60s that absurd claims about women were made and proved empirically and published in leading journals. Now we have to be careful about that in terms of how we use that in order to justify our own point of view. But apart from that, um, I'm not making a claim, as I said before, so we can start wrapping it up because I think that the time is coming into in the place where I am. That's already coming to 11 o'clock, and soon I won't have even the possibility of reason, and then I will be needing a different kind of altruism here, which I'm really enjoying the discussion. I really am. I really am.
Yeah.
And thank you. And I want to thank you again for the invitation. But I want to say that. Apart from the research that we use for justification of our own point of view, is that it's better to start like looking at other stuff, not just condemn them. Difference in terms, but obviously, and that goes back again to the motivation. You say that this company and Bill Gates, as you mentioned, or this or that or whoever, are willing to give 10%. 50% of whoever. That's fine. I've never said don't do it in my paper. I'm saying that let's not be disillusioned about what's happening. I'm not saying don't do. In terms of medicine, I didn't make any claim whatsoever in the paper. In terms of giving shelter, as long as the shelter is here now requires to talk about property again because we are in the capitalism. As long as you give them the house and they don't have anything else that they can have to fear in terms of losing it, no, but that's fine. But in terms of poverty, and this is a category under which all this falls, we shouldn't be disillusioned that we are helping. I think Amia Srinivasan in her review put it even better than I could ever say it, is that it seems in the end that effective altruism is another way for capitalism to reinvent itself, because the discussion we're having right now is not any different than the discussion that was done in the early 20th century between the then altruists Spencer and Kant, or a little bit earlier, than the one that we're having here. It's the same again and again and again. Historically, the philosophical discussion. Okay, that's another thing that can look in our reflective critique. And you can never, and the reason for which the 10% exists is because you have to have you can never escape from self-interest insofar as that self-interest is to be able to sustain yourself in order to give.
Okay. So I think that a few things are true. So one, I mean, I think that you said that there aren't claims that Singer makes you disagree with. You just sort of question the underlying motivation behind them. But I mean, we can question the underlying motivation while still agreeing that the things that are done by effective altruists are good. I think that the things done by effective altruists are very clearly good. You cite that we should distrust science because there's been racist research in the past. Of course, we should distrust science to some degree. But when there have been dozens of studies, maybe hundreds, I don't know exactly, and meta-analyses that have looked at the studies, and they've overwhelmingly concluded that efforts such as foreign aid are very effective efforts promoted by effective altruists. And we have even the critics of foreign aid agreeing that effective altruists forms of aid are good. The most prominent critics of foreign aid agree that what effective altruism does is good, not both in terms of monetary donations and in terms of the health and development programs. They agree that both of those are good and are effective ways of improving the world. I mean, I don't think that we should that we have any reason to think that it's helping capitalism reinvent itself in any way. If anything, I think that it goes against this capitalist notion that we should only care about what's good for ourselves as individuals. It says that we should care about other people and do what's best for other people. I mean, also, even if it were like helping capitalism, I don't think we're going to see an end to capitalism anytime soon. Even if every effective altruist became a revolutionary trying to get rid of capitalism, it wouldn't do anything to undermine the edifice of capitalism, given how deeply entrenched it is. So I think we should do effective altruist things. And if anti-capitalist movements really were the most effective ways of improving the world, then effective altruists, after doing research into that, would conclude that that's the case and would invest in those efforts. The claim was made that it props up capitalism. I mean, I don't know any reason to think that claim is true. And I think that given that there are levels of capitalism, I think if fewer people are dying of malaria under capitalism, that's better than if more people are dying under malaria under capitalism. And if people have better education as a result of not having intestinal worms, people are not on the brink of starvation, that's a better and a less violent world. And the effective altruism movement has done that for millions of people, problematizing random sentences said by effective altruists like Singer and McCaskill doesn't undermine the idea that when figuring out what we should do with our life, we should try to figure out effective ways of helping others. And when the effective altruism movement has prevented 500 million people from getting malaria, I think it's a good thing.
Again, I think we're going into circles again and again. The overwhelming, I think we have exhausted the point of overwhelming evidence. I think, again, I will mention it, unless it's like the evidence that you are bringing are like are given and the proof that is given based on a socially constructed way of doing research.
Which all research is that way.
Which is yes, precisely. And socially constructed means that we have decided on a way of doing things. We could decide otherwise.
Do you apply that skepticism in other domains? So, for example, when deciding,
I know that people would like to see it as skepticism, but just because something is critical, that doesn't mean it's skeptical.
Well, I mean, you think that these are not, that the empirical literature supporting foreign aid and effective altruist programs is not reliable, despite the overwhelming scientific consensus. So my question is, do you apply that doubt in other domains? Do you doubt the overwhelming consensus that climate change exists, for example? Do you doubt evolution despite the overwhelming consensus? I mean,
listen, I'm not going to. I will answer to you this way: is that I make the point when I talk about because here is the crutch, which again we're flirting, but we're not talking about. You seem to be accepting a more what is called in the analytic way of doing philosophy, a moral and a realism, or universalism, if you want to put it this way. And according to this perspective, I will be ascribed to be a moral relativist, sorry, in the sense that I don't ascribe to anything objective. Okay, now I went into the argument of Rachel's because I think that we should go there in order to be able to clarify, and then things will fall out into place based on our discussion. Is that Rachel's argument is a very good one in terms of finding and the objective, like, there must be a transcendental argument. There must be, only if there is such a universal moral way of doing things, we would have perpetuation of cultures and species and stuff. But when we ask, and this is a Kantian way of putting reason, because reason can lead me to there. When we ask, why do we have to be perpetuated, or why do we have to do this? There is no reason.
Well, I mean, I would obviously disagree with that notion because I'm a moral realist, but
Yes, but you cannot just.
that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we could get in. But I have one
It's not a
question.
rabbit hole, but because this is the inceptual part, if I may, you can disagree. But when I ask you what is the reason for perpetuation, you will give me an evolutionary of the species, God, or whatever.
No, I
You will
wouldn't do
still.
that.
No, I'm just saying that the possibilities are what? Biologism or theology?
No, those aren't the possibilities. I mean,
What are the other possibilities that exist so far in this dialectic that exists between relativism and
Parfit's notion of irreducible normativity provides an alternative where there goodness we find it in the fabric of the universe and in our conscious qualia. I think
evolutionism? Yes,
no,
absolutely.
no, not evolutionism. We just it's not good because it corresponds with our evolutionary purpose. Evolution brought about these things that are good and brought about the possibility of it, but it's not. It has normativity is not grounded in evolution, and we could imagine an evolutionary process that produced no normativity. And so I don't think that
You're
normativity
not
applies
answering my
to
question.
non-sentient beings.
You're not answering my question. In Rachel's argument, even if you need like there must be some universal moral laws that need to be there in order for cultures to exist and perpetuate themselves. The question, why should there exist? Why should I exist? Doesn't have an answer. You can speculate. We can speculate
Well,
and we can speculate and we can speculate. There is no answer here.
I can give
Because
an answer. Well, why should you exist? Well, I mean, it's possible that you shouldn't exist. Maybe you should. I assume you should because it seems like your life, you write interesting philosophy papers. But the question of whether or let's assume that you should exist for now, which I is something that I assume. The
okay.
reason you should exist is because your existence improves the well-being of conscious creatures. The well-being of conscious creatures is a good thing.
But that would be my interpretation and your interpretation. Again, that is not something we can verify. As you said, let's assume.
Well,
It
I
would
mean,
be speculation or something that we can say to ourselves like a lullaby. But ultimately, that kind of like givenness that we're trying to say that the universe will not give you that kind of like why I exist, or
I
why,
think
for
it.
example, that person who was a passerby would exist.
Well,
What I'm
I
saying
think
here,
it will. I mean, I think that there was an argument made. I mean, this is a bit down
you
the
know, we can
realism
make
rabbit
again.
hole.
That's the problem with the philosophy of arguments because actually the way that it has been appropriated by a particular way that what Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy ending up in arguments. It's an appropriation. We'll not go there. It's a huge discussion. It will take us to different steps, but.
I mean, in terms of the arguments for moral realism, I mean, one argument is if we just look throughout history, utilitarians have a better moral track record. They've generally been on the right side of history. They've generally been progressives advocating for social change. I think that through introspecting about our phenomenal states, we can come to the conclusion that our happiness is good and that our suffering is bad. I think evolutionary processes would allow us to come to reliable conclusions about our phenomenal state, similarly to
Again,
how.
this is all. I agree with you. You can say that, and I will agree with you, but only insofar as you ascribe to a system of beliefs that will evaluate these things that you evaluate in that particular way. If I
Well,
don't
I've
ascribe to
given.
that if somebody doesn't agree to these axiomatic principles that you said about happiness and about like utilitarians and doing this or that, then you cannot have you cannot have a common ground to even evaluate stuff.
Well, we
That's why.
can, and I'm giving arguments as to why they would be wrong in that case.
But those arguments are based on the reason that you have, based on the principles of existence that you have set, or we have inherited from our culture in the Western world in a particular way. These are not necessarily universal. And even if you, and this is a sadness in philosophy that universal, particular, the dialectics and the binaries. It is a sadness because it doesn't allow you to allow us to think further. And what I want to say is this: my idea of altruism, and the one that my book is trying to show, is that something very simple. Because I like to talk with like phenomenological facts, not a reasonable facts or scientific facts or anything. Something that we can see in the phenomenological world, which is given by itself. If if a baby is born, and it's left on its own devices, what will happen? In itself,
It'll
in
die.
its own laws,
I mean, it'll die.
it'll die. So let's start by thinking about that life and death are like in a very close proximity. They're not moralizing. That's what I'm saying at the end of the paper. Instead of moralizing about death or about life in a way that suits us for particular reasons that we said, let's start from phenomenological facts. And the point that I'm making at the end of the paper is that instead of trying to say what the other people would what we think that other people, what is good for other people, let's invite them in a discussion, which Singer is not willing to do. And that's why I stuck into that particular phrase.
Singer does have discussions with people who disagree with him. And
well, clearly in his paper, he says that if you don't agree with me, don't read further.
Well, no, I mean, his paper was an appeal. His paper was arguing like, if you think this is the case, then you should do this thing because your self-interest is maximized by being altruistic. But if you don't, then this argument won't appeal. He makes arguments in other papers that are attempt to universally appeal to everyone. But I mean, this goes back to the prescriptive-descriptive distinction that I think that we agreed upon largely earlier. But I have a question for you about this. So if we're motivated by trying to maximally improve happiness, do you agree that it's a good way of doing that to donate to effective altruist organizations like the Against Malaria Foundation? Yes or
no? Allow me to overcome the binary of yes or no yet again to say, I know that you find this displeasing, and this is the sadness of the situation, is that we have like in the arguments and yes or no or like this foreclosure encasing someone doesn't allow for a discussion.
Well, you can have a discussion, but this discussion can begin with either a yes or a no.
I would like to understand what we talk about happiness in your question. Why would we put the criterion of happiness? Isn't that a utilitarian principle?
Yeah, it is.
Why should we ascribe directly and axiomatically to happiness?
Well, I mean that gets back to the utilitarian arguments that I gave earlier. But for now,
so you're asking me from the get-go to be put in a register of a utilitarian,
right?
To lead me
I'm saying let's just pretend for a minute that we are utilitarians, okay? Do you agree that if we are utilitarians, we should donate to effective altruist organizations?
If you are utilitarians, I think that I'm not the person that I would tell you about that, because I'm not a utilitarian, and I'm not in the position to say what a utilitarian would say, because I'm not planning to do what utilitarians do. I'm not gonna take the position of a utilitarian when I'm not.
Okay.
So I'm not gonna take the position of refugee when I'm not.
Okay, that's fine. So what is your view of normative ethics, if it's not a utilitarian one?
My view of normative ethics.
Yeah.
Normative ethics is a social construction and an invention that we have in order to be able to organize our lives.
Oh, okay. But so when deciding what you think you should do, how do you decide what you should do? Like if it's a Saturday, how do you decide what you're going to do? Like what decision-making procedure do you apply? I would try to look at what will improve the well-being of sentient beings, being utilitarian. But apparently you wouldn't. So what is that decision-making procedure that you would apply?
Are you asking me why I live?
No, I'm asking you how we determine if we should or shouldn't do something.
So essentially how, in order to, doing something is part of life, isn't it?
Yeah, but my question is, how do we decide which things we should do? Obviously, we have to.
Obviously, from me being consistent, what I do shouldn't be also aligned with what I want to do in my life.
Okay, so you do just the things that you want to do.
Doesn't anybody?
I mean,
you want to help others, you help others. I agree with you here that desire is the first thing that we have to look. What are your desires in your life?
So suppose I was killing people because I wanted to kill people. Presumably, would you condemn my actions? Would you say that I shouldn't kill people? And if so, why?
You're asking me to give you an evaluative judgment on whether it's good that you wanted to kill someone or that you killed someone.
Well, I wanted to kill people, so I killed people.
Okay, I would ask you immediately, why would you want to kill people? What led you to that position in order to be able to have that desire?
Because I find it fun. I just really enjoy it. Let's say.
Okay, and I will ask you again.
For the reference of the audience. In fact, I do not enjoy killing people, nor do I kill people.
But what I'm trying to do, I know, obviously, don't worry about that. The whole point here is the difference of way of looking at things that I want to pursue, is that instead of like putting labels, yes, good is good or not. Obviously, back in ancient times, they were throwing babies off the cliffs because they had a different perspective to life. They had a different ultimate existential perspective to life than we do today, or that they had in medieval times, or they had other times. So that kind of difference. Some people, they will say it's progress that we have moved from throwing babies off the cliff,
right,
rather than not keeping them today. But that again is an evaluation and a perspective. I'm not here to judge whether this is or not.
I know. So, but my question is: so, if I'm a serial killer, make the argument that you would make to a serial killer about why they should stop being a serial killer, or do you have no argument? Like, I mean, are you fine with serial killers? And if not, why not?
Okay. Now, again, I will answer you in a different way that you expect, and I know that it will displease you, but this is only because I want to disturb this way of thinking, which is a little bit dangerous. Why? I'll tell you this. When I was sometimes as a teacher of philosophy, I taught different ages of students, and once I did the trolley problems, right? The kind of problems that we're discussing here, like you're in the situation, all these variables are set. What are you going to do? And you know what? When a student told me, and I was happy that they told me, but I had to deliver that content, so I had to do it. And one student told me, like, I refused to answer, and I said, and it's interesting that came from a girl, and I said, like, why? It's like, I don't want to preempt my thinking by foreclosing possibilities that I will have in real life. If that happened, I will deal with it then. Now, why am I saying this? Is because that I don't ascribe to this thinking of putting norms, which are based on criteria in order to create a normative situation. I know people like that. Western thinking does like that, but I say that it's dangerous in terms of doing the things that I'm also saying in the paper here, of assuming a position of the other when you're assuming the position of the other side of yourself.
Okay, but Hercules, the question that I asked was, are you opposed to people being serial killers? And if so, what is the argument that you would make as why people who are serial killers should stop being serial killers?
Okay, and I'm going to say my previous answer was not to your question. You're absolutely right, and I take the blame for that. My saying is that why are they serial killers?
Because they think it's fun to be a serial killer.
So when they think it's fun, why do they think it's fun? What happened there? Like, how did they came up to understand? And because if I take a human perspective or a behaviorist perspective, that will be that we're classically conditioned into becoming, having associated this as for fun. So she will not explore what are the reasons. If I'm a biologist, I will immediately make the claim that I have a brain damage and they have to be cured because of this and that.
Okay, so
if I'm a biologist, because it will be an easy way sweeping a thing off. If I'm taking the perspective of Rousseau, or if I'm taking the perspective of Tolstoy, I can say that, you know what, it's the conditions of society that may have led them to believe that killing people is fun.
Okay, but I'm not asking what, I mean, there are certain criterion that you use to condemn certain actions. So you generally think that society has an interest in preventing serial killers from existing. So my question is, what is the criterion that you use to determine if we should or should not do a thing? if we should or should not bring about a certain outcome.
I'm saying that in order, I cannot tell you what I cannot tell you my personal criteria for doing something or not doing something. My personal criteria is trying to understand what the other thinks.
Well, okay,
That's my
but
personal. That's how I define, if you will. If I define, not define in the sense of like intellectually define, but phenomenologically describe altruism. I said, as I said in the paper, and I'm saying in my book, is that altruism begins when you adopt the other and try to understand them. But because trying cannot have felicity criteria, you need to constantly try to understand the other, with no end, with no particular end in place.
okay, so you think that normatively we should just try to understand the other, regardless of its impact on the well-being of conscious creatures?
Normatively, no. Not
Okay,
in the
wait.
sense of a norm like that should be placed in order to be able to for us to be also suffocated. I'm not ascribing to normative ethics.
Okay, but
Because I believe that whatever you do is ethical to begin with.
okay,
It's a
so
different.
but so what is it the case that what you think we should do is what allows us to understand the other, regardless of its fullest consequences?
If you put it in these terms, precisely because I'm saying asking the other, questioning the other, immediately, even if you put a normative place or label to questioning, I'm questioning myself by and question the other, it loses all its normative thing because it allows it not to be a norm.
Oh, okay, but the question that I asked was, should we try to understand the other, regardless of its impact on the well-being of conscious creatures? Yes or no?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Should we try to understand the other, regardless of its impact on the well-being of conscious creatures? Yes or no?
Should we try to understand the other, irrespective? Sorry, I'm getting tired, so I might have to say it again.
Regardless of
Slowly,
its
please.
regardless of its impact on the well-being of conscious creatures.
That's a hold on a second. I see that I cannot understand this question well.
Oh, I can type it in the chat.
Should we understand, because I don't have a like, I'm assuming that you're having questions from people who are in the live feed, I'm assuming. Now, should we try to understand people regardless, you said, of the well-being?
I typed it in the chat here, and now it's shown on screen.
Should we attempt to understand the other regardless of its impact on the well-being of conscious creatures? Okay, now let me do a close reading of this question. Should we? It's not yes or no. You see, you're it's a different way of approaching things.
Well, unless you deny the law of not.
First, I need to see like the possibilities of meaning that this will take me, this paths that will take me this question. Should we attempt to understand the other, regardless of its impact? Now, this, I'm assuming that the apostrophe there shouldn't be. It should be an it's as a possessive. Its impact, right?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So its impact, that kind of like relative pronoun there goes in. It's the is that the understanding or the whole project? Because obviously the scope of the it's could go either to understanding or to the other or to the whole project.
It is describing attempting to understand the other.
So the whole project. So
yeah.
Should we attempt to understand the other regardless of the of whether the attempt to understand the other has an impact on the well-being of conscious creatures? But who are we trying to understand if we're not trying to understand conscious creatures?
Well, we're trying to understand conscious creatures, but the question is, should we attempt to understand them, even if the process of attempting to understand them will negatively impact the well-being of conscious creatures? So suppose I could do an excavation and figure out the motivations of other people and figure out an understanding of the other. But I know that if I do that, there is some evil serial killer who's going to like murder 5 million people if I do that. Should we should I still do that even if it has a detrimental impact on the well-being of conscious creatures?
But again, we're like you see here now, we're creatures, because here, if you one object of the understanding is the other, whom I cannot see how another be a conscious cannot not be a conscious creature. And then you're giving me another thought experiment here by saying that imagine that I'm trying to understand another, and a serial killer is killing how many people? Right now I can make the claim that we are trying to understand each other, and capitalism is looming and killing so many people. It's happening. So what we should do, you and I both, should we stop and start like overthrowing capitalism? Do you
So
see what I'm trying to say? Is that what you're describing is happening
you're,
right
you're,
now?
you're saying things that are interesting, but they're still not answering the question of should we do an excavation and try to understand the other, even if it's bad for the well-being of conscious creatures.
But what does it mean bad here? You see, like we're
Even if it makes it so that there's less happiness in the world.
Okay, so
and
again,
more suffering.
I'm saying to you, you're forcing me, you're conducing me, or you're slightly introducing me into thinking in your own terms. Again, what I told you earlier is the thinking of the other of the same. What you're trying to do now is what I'm saying that McCaskill and Singer do in their effective altruism is that they interpret the other not by having a presence of the other, by representing them in their own terms. Just like you right now are trying to force me into a utilitarian thinking, which I'm telling you that I do not ascribe.
I'm not trying to force you into anything. I want an answer to this question. Should we attempt to?
The answer to question that you elicit is within the grammar of a utilitarian.
No, it's not. It's within your grammar. You can answer it however you want. You can say either yes or no, and then provide an explanation for that answer. I'm not asking you to explain it from a utilitarian frame. I'm asking you to explain it from your frame. Because what you said is when I asked you how we determine what you should do, you said that normativity is grounded in attempts to understand the other. So
I didn't say normativity. I said like even if you put it in normative terms, it will still displace itself and neutralize itself because it will not be normative anymore.
Yeah, what we should do should be to try to understand the other. So then I'm asking you, let's say there's a conflict between something that will improve the well-being of conscious creatures and allow us to understand the other. Should we still do that? And it seems intuitively like we probably shouldn't. So if my understanding of you resulted in millions of people dying, I probably shouldn't try to understand you. And so that proves that I think that it can't be grounded in the way that you attempt to ground what we should do. And you're not answering.
That's why I'm saying to you, a question already we know from Plato, from Meno, the discussion, that in order to say something, you cannot ask a question about nothing. Already the question presupposes somehow its answer. We know that from ancient times, from Plato, from the dialogue of Plato. Okay, now what I want you to say is that your question already presupposes a particular way of answering it.
It doesn't. I mean, there's nothing loaded in the question. The question doesn't assume anything. It asks if this were the case, what should we do?
If it was the case that there was somebody, you already presuppose good and bad in terms of evaluating things. Well, and that good and bad requires criteria.
Well, yeah, you use a criterion there's a criterion that you use, and you use it to determine whether or not you should do certain things. You said that criterion that you use to determine if you should do certain things is understanding the other. I gave you a case where I don't think that would conflict with the well-being of conscious creatures, and you're not willing to answer the question of whether or not we should.
I didn't. This is a typical thing that is happening also in a particular way of thinking. I didn't universalize the argument. It was said within context. I said, like, if we want to be authentically altruistic, we should, like in the case of Singer, we should start by understanding the other. In this case, the altruist, the immigrant of Bengal, or whoever has a problem of poverty, to understand. That's what I said. I didn't.
Okay,
Now, usually,
great. So
because
then the
hold on
question
a
is,
second,
if
hold on a
that,
second, because this is important. Because we have a tendency in a particular way of doing philosophy to to take out, to extract, like as if you're taking parts of something, and you're making an argument, and this argument is supposedly to hold in all the cases. Then you're saying that you're normatively presupposing that. I'm not universalizing here. I'm just saying that with respect to what Singer is saying, altruism in this case, and an effective altruism as such, for the case of poverty, should, according to my opinion in this particular paper, okay, should start by what Singer was not willing to do in the beginning, to try to understand the other. Because if
okay,
you
right.
don't try to
So,
understand the other and impose your own views on the other, which we have done, and that's why we have that kind of particular way of like thinking of us, in the Western world. We impose our ways of life onto the other, and then we try, as I told you earlier, we try to ameliorate the imposition, to make it less.
right. So I understand that. So my challenge to that view that says that if we want to be altruistic, we should try to understand the other is, so suppose that we have a choice. So we can either understand the other or dramatically improve the well-being of conscious creatures. Which one should we do? Because that poses a case where the rules that are advocated by Singer diverge from the rules that are advocated by you. And so I think that Singer's rule stands up better. So Singer would say when we're trying to be altruistic, we should look at what improves the well-being of conscious creatures. You say that we should look at the other. And what
No,
allows us to understand
I didn't say that.
and what allows us to understand the other. So then the question is, if those are in contradiction, which one should we do? And I've been asking you this question for about 10 minutes, and you still have not given an answer to the question.
Precisely, and I'm still going to give the answer that you're expecting, because you put me into answer in terms of well-being.
Well, yeah. I'm not putting you in terms of answering well-being, but the question doesn't ask in the
You said,
context of that. I mean,
you said,
do you deny the law of the excluded middle? I assume you agree that statements are either true or false, right? I mean, that's an
excuse me, statements are we can take. I told you earlier, there's a way that that we have constructed logic, mathematical logic, by excluding the middle and by working on the principle of non-contradiction. But the most serious philosophers of all time know that this cannot be ultimately proven. Even Aristotle cannot prove it in his metaphysics that there is. He's saying that you have to accept it axiomatically in
right.
order to be able to
Are you
do
willing
that.
to axiomatically accept the law of non-contradiction, or sorry, not the law of the excluded middle, as a basic?
Precisely because it violates a lot of people in the way that life is, because I told you that life excludes by itself the excluded middle, because at the same time that we're living, we're dying in the same instance and the same place. There's no contradiction between life and death in this instance. And because precisely
Wait,
people
wait.
cannot be characterized by excluded middles as in the mathematical logic, I'm not willing to sacrifice my thinking by putting it into this normative way of excluding middles.
Wait, the excluded middle is descriptive, not normative. Wait, so just yes or no, or do you think that the law of the excluded middle, are you willing to accept it? I mean, like,
I will
90,
answer, I will answer to you in the way that you want here. The social construction of thinking with the excluded middle is a construction which I'm trying to avoid as much as I can.
okay, I mean, like, the number, I mean, the like, the most basic supposition of philosophy that philosophers now universally agree upon is that the law of identity, excluded middle, and non-contradiction are true and can be assumed axiomatically. I mean, like,
that is that. I'm sorry to say, but this will be analytic philosophy in a particular interpretation of a particular ancient text.
I mean, even Hegel didn't deny the law of non-contradiction or excluded middle. Hegel just argued that things at one time can be contradicted by things that come at a later time, so they're temporally distinct. I mean, can you give me you said that death and life are not in contradiction, not opposite. Can you give me an example of something that could be simultaneously alive and dead without equivocating?
You and I, we're not dead. You don't change this thing. Living and dying, I said. Living and dying. I didn't say life and death. I said living and dying. Living and dying is the same thing, precisely because right now I'm both living and dying.
Sure, I would agree that living and dying are not incompatible, but would you agree that life and death are incompatible?
Life and death, that is a thought that you cannot make, because you have reified one condition that is based on your perception of your own experience, and then an experience of the other, because you cannot have an experience of death.
Hercules, the question was, are life and death incompatible? Yes or no? Can you be both alive and dead at the same time?
Can you be both alive and dead? But I'm telling you that the comparison that you're making is not a just comparison. And you don't want me, again, you're forcing me to go into a particular path, which I'm trying to show you, which is like a path that I don't want to go, because you are saying that alive and dead. How can I judge something that I have experience of being alive with something and compare it with something that I've never had experience of, which is being dead?
So is your answer that you don't know if being alive and dead are incompatible? Or do you know if they're incompatible? And if so, are they or are they not incompatible?
I cannot conceive how my experience of being alive, because I can have a reference of being alive, can be compared to something that I don't have experience, being dead.
Oh, but okay, that was not an answer, I think, to the question that I
It
asked.
Is an answer. It is an answer. It's a clear answer.
There are three options. It's either you know or you don't know, and if you know, they're either compatible or incompatible.
I'm giving you the middle term, and you don't accept it.
Okay, I mean, so if you deny the law of the excluded middle, can you give an example of a statement that is neither true nor false, other than the ones the questions that you've been unwilling to answer in this conversation?
I have been. Let's clarify for the sake of the recording that I'm giving an answer which is not adhering to the criteria that someone would accept as an answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, you are saying words in response to the question that I asked, but that doesn't make it an answer. If I ask you, like, are you located in Europe? And you say, I think that dogs make good pets. That would be, in the most literal sense, an answer to the question, but it wouldn't truly answer the question, because it's not responsive to the things that the questions have asked. And I've asked you a series of questions that you have not answered.
I'm telling you, I'm trying to show you performative now that this is the kind of thing that McCaskill and Singer does. You set the criteria of what an answer is based on the criteria that you have set of the question. And if something doesn't fit your own criteria that you have already set as an answer, then that means that you will override it as not an answer. And that's what I'm saying, that this is how it's been done with effective altruism in a sense. Now,
I mean, I've like a question that I've asked is, should we attempt to understand the other, regardless of its impact on the well-being of conscious creatures? You did not answer that question. You riffed on the question. You said a lot of things that hinted at. I mean, it's like with LaCroix. Like, I mean, your answers to the question were to an answer to the question what LaCroix is to like actual grape juice, like, or not grape juice, like fruit juice. There was a hint and there was a trace there.
I'm really enjoying. I did answer your question by saying to you, your question included the conceptual construct of a well-being, and that well-being.
Pointing out a thing about the question isn't an answer to the question. Are there terms in the question that you don't understand what they mean?
Hold on a second. I'm saying that the question that you're asking me is said is presupposing the logic that is forcing me to answer it with. I'm providing you a different logic to that question. I'm asking you to give me a question which does not already include the utilitarian way of thinking that you are forcing me to go to.
My question uses the word well-being. It does not
Yes.
force you to answer as a utilitarian. It does so
Tell
you
me,
have said the criterion for altruism should be understanding the other. I and Singer have suggested that it should be improving the well-being of conscious creatures. So now I'm asking you, suppose that they conflict. So we can either understand the other or improve the well-being of conscious creatures. Which one should we do? If you're, well, I mean, we're hypothetically assuming that we can't do both. For the purpose of this hypothetical, in order to test which principle is better.
That violent? That's what I'm trying to tell you. Why do we have to stick to binaries again and exclude the middle? Why can we not do both and can do more and can do and find more gradations between the two? That's what I'm telling you.
So you've said that you've problematized Singer's principle for altruism and suggested an alternative principle for altruism. I'm giving you a case where those two principles would come to different conclusions, and I'm asking you to take a stance. You can't say that we could certainly imagine hypothetical scenarios where there's the case. So, for example, suppose that the government goes to you and says, we have $1 billion. We can either spend this $1 billion helping you to do research into the other, or we could spend it to do a program that we know would end world poverty. That scenario is unlikely to occur, but in that scenario, which one would you choose? I could tell you in an instant the one that I would choose. I would choose to end world poverty because I think that the well-being of conscious creatures matters a heck of a lot more than understanding the other. And you're not willing to answer that question. And I think that's because it poses a flaw in your view, because it shows that your view has absurd conclusions that would say that we should cause everyone to die if only it resulted in us having a marginally better understanding of the other.
I really like the way that you're trying to say, but here you have some kind of like fundamental difference in terms of let's say ways of life, forms of life, as Wittgenstein would say. I think that, and that's why the dialogue is important. And this is the point when Nietzsche becomes even more important to say that this is a power. Now imagine that we are like two different countries, that we are having different opinions. Now it will be a power dynamic if one wants to impose oneself on another, wouldn't it? So what I'm trying to say here is that there is no ultimate way of ascertaining something objectively. We will construct it if we want. If we don't, we won't. But then imposing one on the other is not, I think, something that could be ethical. And I told you, I don't moralize, I don't go normative, I go by ethical. There's a whole difference in terms of what morality is. Now, we can be, what Deleuze says, incompossibles. We can find a way to allow each one to have their own and say factualize. That's what Feyerabend says in his epistemological anarchy, in terms of epistemology, obviously, not for political reasons. He denies it, but I'm using it for based on by appropriating now. Or to use what Arendt says, to have new natalities. This is how the cultures came to be, by having differences and having different ways of thinking that could be flourished and taken to different perspectives. We don't have to impose one person's view on another. You are wanting to be effective altruism. Things can both happen if we want them to.
Right, but in the hypothetical that I've given, they can't. But I mean, do you think that you've presented an argument for why donating to effective altruist organizations like the Against Malaria Foundation is a thing that people shouldn't do? Because I think that I've given an argument as to why it's a thing that people should do. It prevents children from dying of malaria. And if you don't think that you have an argument as to why we shouldn't do it, then I think that would be a fine place to end the conversation. But so do you think you have an argument?
I would say I have a different argument.
But the question is, do you have an argument as to why it's bad to donate to effective altruist organizations, why we shouldn't donate to effective altruist organizations?
As I said in the beginning of our discussion, so we can end it, because indeed I'm starting to get drowsy and losing my my way of thought. Not that I ever had it in one way, perhaps. But my point, my attempt, my argument Okay, in this case, the argument that I'm doing in this paper and in my book is an argument which is not an argument of convincing someone about what is the case, is an attempt, an undertaking of making manifest some of the things that could possibly happen or happening in philosophizing about effective altruism on a philosophical ground.
Wait, but okay, Hercules, you got to answer this question. Do you have an argument that you have given that you think indicates that we shouldn't give to effective altruist organization? Please begin your answer with either a yes or a no, and then you can unpack it with context afterwards. I mean, this is reminding me of presidential debates where when candidates are asked questions, they'll talk about other things and they'll make these sort of broad claims, but not answer the questions in specific. I mean, just yes or no. Do you think that you have an argument as to why people should not give to effective altruist organization?
In one sense, yes. In one sense, no.
Okay. All right. I think we can end the conversation there. You said you're getting drought, or I mean, if you want to give a final.
I'm really enjoying it. It's just that it's difficult when we're not willing to accept an answer that we don't for based on the criteria that we set an answer for. We won't ever accept it. Now, anyway. I'm happy to do the conversation again if you want. I'm happy to discuss more if you want. I'm absolutely delighted because I don't have a problem. We can discuss even further. I was really delighted, and that's why I stayed the almost 3 and 10 minutes, and I enjoyed myself here discussing with you. I hope you did the same, and I hope the people who were watching, if they were watching, to and to have enjoyed a little bit that kind of different discussion that took place.
Yeah, it was good discussion. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for watching, everyone. All right.
Have a good evening or afternoon. I don't know what time is there right now, so enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, you as well. Thank you.